In today's episode, we're going to cover all the most unbelievable Bigfoot encounters we featured on our channel throughout 2025. These are the most shocking and mysterious sightings that left witnesses questioning everything they thought they knew about what's lurking in our forests. On September 15, 2018, search teams found Cecilia Mangrove's empty campsite in Olympic National Forest, Washington. She was a scientist who had left 3 days earlier, but her broken phone and camera gear hinted she'd encountered something unusual in the wilderness, sparking the most mysterious disappearance in the Pacific Northwest.
It's an elusive creature.
Cecilia, a 29-year-old environmental scientist and avid hiker from Portland, Oregon, set out on September 11, 2018. She packed her gear for what should have been a routine 3-day expedition. The destination was Whisper Creek Trail in Olympic National Forest, a place so isolated that park rangers joked it saw more bears than hikers. But that's exactly what made it perfect for Cecilia's research on old-growth forest recovery. What she didn't realize was just how far from civilization she was traveling, or that this remote stretch of forest, rarely visited by humans, might be hiding something extraordinary, something out of legend, something the locals whispered about but few had ever seen, and something they called Bigfoot. What her family didn't know was that Cecilia had spent that day methodically documenting the forest. Between 6 and 8 p.m. on September 11th, she took over 100 photos, far more than her usual evening routine. As an environmental scientist studying forest recovery, she typically photographed tree formations and growth patterns. But that evening was different. Her camera focused on areas where vegetation grew unusually thick and trees had strange, irregular shapes. Her research journal, found later at the campsite, revealed why. Detailed notes described strange wildlife signs and unusual disturbances in the forest floor. The final entry, dated September 11th at 10:30 p.m., described something large that had recently moved through the area. Broken branches 8 feet high and unusual track marks near the creek. She planned to investigate further the next day. The weather stayed perfect throughout the night, with clear skies and calm winds. According to weather data, conditions were ideal for the wildlife watching and photography work that Cecilia had planned for the next day. Nothing in the weather suggested any reason to worry about her safety or the success of her trip. September 12, 2018, started like any other day for people waiting to hear from Cecilia Mangrove. According to the detailed plan she had submitted to both her employer and the Olympic National Forest Ranger Station, she was supposed to pack up camp early and hike the remaining 4 miles to Summit Lake, where she planned to set up her main research base. No one expected to hear from her during this day, since the deeper wilderness areas of Whisper Creek Trail had no cell phone coverage. Cecilia had noted this in her planning documents and had also informed both her brother Marcus and her boss. Her satellite communication device, a Garmin InReach Explorer that she carried on all solo trips, was set to send automatic location signals every 4 hours during daylight. The device sent its final signal at 6:18 a.m. on September 12th, showing her position at the campsite where she had spent the night. After that time, the device went completely silent. This was unusual, but not immediately scary, since satellite coverage could be spotty in the thick forest of the Olympic Peninsula. September 13th was the day Cecilia was supposed to come back. Her plan said she would pack up camp at Summit Lake by 8 a.m. and hike back to the trailhead, getting there by 4 p.m. Marcus Mangrove had arranged to meet her for dinner in Portland that evening, something they always did after each of her major solo trips. When 6 p.m. came and went without a word from his sister, Marcus started calling her cell phone. All calls went straight to voicemail. At first, Marcus wasn't too worried. Cecilia had been late coming back from hikes before, usually because she found something interesting to research, or the trail was harder than expected. She was careful about safety, but also passionate about her work, and he knew she might stay longer if she discovered something scientifically important. However, as the evening went on and his calls kept going unanswered, he started to worry more. By 10 p.m. on September 13th, Marcus had left 12 voicemails and sent many text messages. He also checked Cecilia's Instagram account, hoping to see a post explaining why she was late, but her last update was still the campfire photo from September 11th. This was very unusual. Cecilia usually posted daily during her trips, and she had never gone more than 24 hours without some form of communication during a solo hike. September 14th brought more worry. Cecilia was scheduled for a 9 a.m. conference call with her research team at work, something she had never missed. When she didn't join the call, her supervisor, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, immediately contacted Marcus. By noon, both Marcus and Dr. Walsh had driven to the Whisper Creek trailhead, where they found Cecilia's Honda CR-V exactly where she had parked it 3 days earlier. The car was locked and undisturbed. Her spare key, which she always hid in a magnetic case under the rear bumper, was still there. Inside the car, they found her purse, wallet, and a detailed backup copy of her research notes, things she never would have left behind if she had returned safely. Most concerning was finding her emergency contact card on the dashboard, which listed Marcus's phone number and included specific instructions about when to contact authorities if she failed to return. At 2:47 p.m. on September 14th, Marcus called the Olympic National Forest Ranger Station to report his sister missing. Ranger Elena Vasquez, who had processed Cecilia's backcountry permit, immediately understood how serious the situation was. Cecilia was known to park staff as an experienced and reliable hiker who always followed safety rules. Her failure to return as scheduled was completely unlike her. The first response was quick but limited. 2 park rangers hiked the first 3 miles of Whisper Creek Trail that afternoon, calling Cecilia's name and looking for any signs of her. They found nothing unusual on the main trail and returned to organize a bigger search effort for the next day. September 15th marked the beginning of the official search and rescue operation. At dawn, a team of 12 searchers, including park rangers, volunteer search and rescue people, and a dog unit, entered the Whisper Creek Trail. The search team had GPS devices, emergency medical supplies, and communication equipment to coordinate their efforts across the challenging terrain. The most important breakthrough in Cecilia Mangrove's disappearance came from finding her iPhone 8, discovered by search and rescue teams 50 yards downstream from her abandoned campsite. The device was lodged partly underwater in Whisper Creek, trapped between 2 rocks in shallow water. Despite significant water damage and a badly cracked screen, crime lab technicians were able to recover much of the phone's data, though some files were partially corrupted. What they could reconstruct revealed a chilling sequence of events that appeared to occur in the early morning hours of September 12, 2018. According to the phone's metadata, Cecilia's final photo sequence began at exactly 6:23 a.m. The first image was deceptively ordinary, a golden sunrise streaming through the trees, captured from inside her tent. The composition suggested she had woken naturally, starting her day with routine environmental documentation, photographing the forest floor and light patterns. The photo was calm, almost serene, masking the ominous events about to unfold. 2 minutes later, at 6:25 a.m., the second photo marked a dramatic shift. Cecilia had intentionally focused on a massive footprint pressed deep into the muddy ground beside Whisper Creek. Analysis revealed the print measured approximately 18.5 inches long and 7.2 inches wide, with clearly defined toe impressions and a skin-like texture along the pads. The depth suggested the creature weighed far more than any known wildlife in the Olympic Peninsula. It was unlike a bear, elk, or human, and the freshness of the imprint suggested it had been made while she slept in her tent just yards away. At 6:28 a.m., Cecilia's third photo captured the tree line about 30 yards from her campsite. At first glance, it seemed like a routine forest shot, but digital enhancement revealed a dark, upright silhouette, partially hidden among the evergreen branches. The figure appeared unusually tall, roughly 8 feet, and moved in a way that didn't match any known animal in the region. Judging by the angle and framing, Cecilia seemed to have paused briefly, adjusting her camera to capture the figure without drawing attention. Leaves rustled beneath it, branches snapped softly, and a shadow swept across the clearing. Even through her scientific lens, the scene was extraordinary, unsettling, and completely unexpected. The fourth photo, taken at 6:31 a.m., showed Cecilia's face, wide-eyed and tense, her mouth slightly open as if holding her breath. Reflections in her eyes hinted at movement in the tree line, though the background remained blurry. The image captured both her terror and the realization that she was witnessing something extraordinary, something unlike any known wildlife. At 6:34 a.m., Cecilia's phone recorded a 47-second audio clip that sent chills through forensic analysts. Her whispering voice, punctuated by shallow, rapid breaths, indicated panic but also intentional documentation. Overlapping her voice were the sounds of footsteps on leaves, snapping twigs, and a low, guttural noise. The tonal quality of the sound was unlike any known mammal or bird call in the region. Midway through the clip, Cecilia's voice surged, narrating rapidly and carefully, noting movement, proximity, and behaviors of whatever she had encountered. Then, abruptly, a loud crack, a tree branch breaking under massive weight, ended the recording, followed by static. The phone likely dropped or was damaged in the scramble that followed. Between 6:25 and 6:36 a.m., her camera, audio and drafts, revealed an escalating encounter. She typed 2 urgent messages she never sent. One to her brother, Marcus, instructing him to check the photos if anything happened, and one to her supervisor, explaining she had discovered something extraordinary that could revolutionize her ecological reports. The unsent messages implied that Cecilia's observation window had been brief, minutes, possibly seconds, before her situation became dire. During the early part of this period, her recordings and notes captured a mix of careful scientific observation and growing alarm. Every detail, the massive footprint, the distant silhouette in the tree line, and the unusual guttural sounds, was documented meticulously, highlighting her instinct to record what she was witnessing even as the encounter intensified. The GPS data from her phone painted a frantic picture. After the 6:31 a.m. photo, the device tracked rapid movement away from the campsite, approximately 200 yards in under 3 minutes. Her path was erratic, sudden stops, abrupt changes in direction, and repeated backtracking, suggesting she was moving to both observe and evade. Disturbed brush and broken branches along the route supported the theory that a large creature had been moving near her, if not following her. Enhancing the audio from the camera, experts noted a sequence of steps heavier than a human's, but lighter than a large bear, interspersed with the guttural noises. The sound suggested deliberate observation. The creature was close enough to leave detailed prints, but not immediately visible to her. Cecilia's whispers reveal her scientific instincts kicking in. She notes movement, branch position, and sound direction, documenting the phenomenon while experiencing primal fear. By 6:36 a.m., the situation escalated. Cecilia's satellite communicator attempted to send an SOS via her Garmin InReach Explorer. Only a fragmented message with GPS coordinates was transmitted before the device failed, likely due to damage or environmental interference. This last transmission, combined with the GPS, camera, and audio data, indicated that Cecilia encountered a massive, intelligent, and mobile presence in the forest, one she had been observing intentionally but could not fully escape or communicate about. The investigation into Cecilia Mangrove's disappearance suggests she may not have been entirely alone in the Whisper Creek area during her final expedition. Jake Morrison, a 34-year-old software developer from Tacoma, had been camping about 2 miles north of Cecilia's location on the night of September 11-12, 2018. An experienced backpacker with over 15 years of wilderness experience, Morrison shared a troubling account that aligns loosely with the timeline from Cecilia's digital evidence, hinting that someone, or something, may have been in the area at the same time. Morrison told investigators he woke at 6:30 a.m. on September 12th to a chilling 10-second howl from Whisper Creek, unlike anything he'd heard in his years outdoors. When he returned from checking the area, his campsite was unnervingly tidy, yet altered. Water bottles neatly by the fire ring, boots moved and aligned. Nothing was stolen or damaged, leaving him convinced it was deliberate, too organized to be wildlife mischief. Park Ranger Elena Vasquez, who had worked in Olympic National Forest for 15 years, provided crucial context about the unusual evidence found at Cecilia's campsite. In her decade and a half of investigating wildlife encounters and missing person cases, she said the prints were unlike anything she had documented before. They were larger than bear tracks, wrong shape for humans, and the stride length was unusually long, suggesting something that walked upright. Vasquez's testimony revealed a pattern of unusual incidents in the Whisper Creek area that had been quietly logged but not widely publicized. Over the previous 5 years, 3 separate hikers had reported disturbing encounters in the same region where Cecilia disappeared. Park officials had categorized these as unexplained incidents, but chose not to release them broadly, concerned it might discourage visitors or fuel speculation about the forest. The first incident occurred in September 2014, when a married couple hiked a remote stretch of the Whisper Creek Trail and reported feeling as though they were being followed. For over 2 miles, they heard snapping branches and low, indistinct noises that seemed to come from all around. Shadows shifted at the edges of their vision, disappearing whenever they tried to focus directly on them. By the time they reached the trailhead, they were shaken, convinced that something unusually large had been moving through the forest near them. The second incident occurred in October 2016, when a solo hiker reported several blurry photographs showing a large, upright figure moving among the dense evergreens. The images were grainy, but the shape appeared unusually tall, with movements that seemed deliberate and disturbingly human-like. The hiker also recalled hearing heavy footfalls nearby, and low, resonant sounds that seemed to come from different directions within the forest, though it was impossible to pinpoint their source. The third encounter occurred just 8 months before Cecilia's disappearance. A group of college students camping in the area awoke to find their site disturbed, in a way reminiscent of Jake Morrison's later report. Tents were partially torn, supplies had been moved, and unusually large footprints, estimated at around 6 feet in length, were pressed into the soft ground surrounding the camp. Initially, they assumed a bear had wandered through, but the size and spacing of the prints suggested deliberate movement. Some of the students reported catching brief glimpses of a dark, hulking figure at the edge of the tree line, disappearing whenever they looked directly. Perhaps the most significant testimony came from Thomas Clearwater, a 73-year-old Quinault elder, explained to investigators that his people had always considered the Whisper Creek area both sacred and dangerous. According to tribal stories, the forest doesn't take kindly to those who try to take more than they should. Tribal records passed down through generations documented 7 unexplained disappearances in that area over the past century, with most happening in early fall when the forest is said to be most protective. In the weeks following Cecilia Mangrove's disappearance, investigators developed 4 main theories to explain what happened during her final hours in the Olympic wilderness. Each theory was carefully examined against the available evidence, but none of the conventional explanations could adequately account for all the disturbing details recovered from the scene. Investigators looked at several possible explanations for what happened to Cecilia. At first, a wildlife attack seemed most likely. The Olympic Peninsula has black bears and mountain lions that can attack people. Claw marks on her tent and the disturbed campsite suggested a large predator had been there. But this idea fell apart when they looked closer. There was no blood at the scene, despite signs of violence. Even stranger, Cecilia's belongings were carefully arranged, her boots placed neatly together, her camera equipment secured in waterproof bags, and her phone positioned in the creek rather than scattered around. Large predators don't organize things this way. Some thought a human predator might have followed Cecilia's social media posts and tracked her down. This would explain why her belongings were deliberately arranged instead of randomly destroyed. But the massive 18-inch footprints around the campsite were way too big for any human. Audio specialists said the recorded sounds didn't match anything humans or known wildlife could make. Plus, the remote location and difficult terrain made it unlikely a stalker could reach the area without leaving their own evidence trail. Another possibility was that Cecilia had an accident. Maybe she fell into Whisper Creek, got hypothermia, or injured, and became confused before dying from exposure. Finding her phone in the water seemed to support this idea at first, but her photos and audio recordings clearly showed she was alert and actively documenting something extraordinary in her final moments. Her pictures were well composed and focused, not the confused work of someone suffering from injury or exposure. Despite searching over 50 square miles, no trace of her body was ever found, though investigators noted that dense terrain can hide remains for years. The most controversial explanation for Cecilia Mangrove's disappearance was a Bigfoot encounter. The evidence was striking. Massive footprints with unusual ridge-like textures, audio recordings of unidentified sounds, coarse hair samples that defied DNA analysis, and a historical pattern of similar sightings in the region. Cecilia's final photos and audio suggested she had come face to face with something that both terrified and fascinated her, something she deemed important enough to document despite the risk. Her behavior mirrored reports from other Pacific Northwest Bigfoot encounters, where witnesses often described simultaneous fear and scientific curiosity. The convergence of physical evidence, witness accounts, and regional precedent made the cryptid theory difficult to dismiss. Skeptics argued that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, but supporters pointed to Cecilia's meticulous documentation as exactly that proof that could have reshaped understanding of the phenomenon had she survived to share it. Analysis of Cecilia's phone, GPS, photos, and audio revealed a clear sequence of events. First, the massive footprint, then a distant silhouette in the tree line, followed by direct auditory interaction, and finally her frantic movements as captured by GPS. Each stage escalated both tension and danger for Cecilia and for investigators reconstructing the encounter. The combination of her careful scientific documentation and the terrifying reality of an unseen, massive presence makes this one of the most compelling modern Bigfoot cases on record. The Olympic Peninsula has long been a hotspot for cryptid activity, with more than 200 documented Bigfoot sightings since the 1950s. What made Cecilia's case particularly significant was how her findings fit into this larger pattern, adding weight to a decades-long series of mysterious encounters. Environmental factors further strengthened the plausibility of her observations. Whisper Creek Trail is remote, with dense undergrowth, fallen logs, and uneven terrain. Sounds carry differently in thick forests, and shadows can conceal movement. For a trained environmental scientist like Cecilia, the combination of unusual footprints, auditory anomalies, and visual evidence made the encounter strikingly credible. In the 2 years before Cecilia's disappearance, the Olympic National Forest received 12 reports of unusual encounters within a 20-mile radius of Whisper Creek. Witnesses described consistent signs, massive footprints, strange sounds, a feeling of being watched, and behavior suggesting intelligence beyond normal wildlife. Park officials largely kept these reports confidential to prevent panic and protect tourism. But Cecilia's case brought them into the public record. What investigators discovered about Cecilia's preparation for the trip added another layer to the mystery. Her browser history revealed extensive research into local cryptid reports in the weeks leading up to her expedition. As part of her work on old-growth forest recovery, Cecilia had been studying the effects of wildlife on forest ecosystems, and she noted that many cryptid reports mentioned undisturbed areas and unusual animal activity. She had visited forums dedicated to Bigfoot encounters, downloaded academic papers about primate behavior, and bookmarked articles specifically about the Olympic Peninsula's history of unexplained sightings. This wasn't casual curiosity. Cecilia appeared to be approaching the search methodically, using her ecological research as a framework for documenting and potentially verifying an extraordinary presence. Dr. Sarah Marvis, a primatologist at the University of Washington, provided crucial expert analysis of the audio evidence recovered from Cecilia's phone. After studying the 47-second recording, Dr. Marvis concluded that the sounds contained acoustic properties unlike any known North American wildlife. The sounds demonstrated a vocal range and resonance that exceeded human capabilities while showing structured patterns that suggested intelligence and intentional communication. The physical evidence was equally compelling. Plaster casts of the footprints around Cecilia's campsite showed detailed textures along the pads and toes, suggesting they were made by a living creature rather than a carved hoax. The stride length, over 6 feet, indicated bipedal movement by a creature significantly larger than any known primate species. Perhaps most intriguing was the behavioral evidence. The careful arrangement of Cecilia's belongings, the organized disturbance of Jake Morrison's campsite, and the historical pattern of similar encounters suggested intelligence and possibly even curiosity about human activities. This aligned with indigenous accounts of forest guardians who observed and interacted with humans in complex ways. The Olympic Peninsula's dense forests, abundant wildlife, and minimal human traffic provide ideal conditions for a large, elusive species to remain hidden. What set Cecilia's case apart was her meticulous documentation and scientific expertise. She captured fleeting evidence that had eluded countless others: subtle movements in the shadows, sounds with unusual patterns, and hints of an unseen observer. The tragedy was that her encounter ended with her disappearance, leaving these discoveries as clues without resolution. Even so, her findings remain controversial. In the scientific community and among the public, many dismiss the case as folklore or suggest Cecilia may have fabricated the clues. Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest have long been part of local legend, and skeptics argue that extraordinary claims require far more verifiable proof. Yet whispers persist. Hikers near Whisper Creek occasionally discover strange footprints, fresh disturbances, or fleeting glimpses of dark shapes at the edge of vision. Some report hearing low, resonant calls in the early morning mist, eerily similar to those captured on Cecilia's recordings. The forest seems to guard its secrets carefully, revealing just enough to intrigue the curious and unsettle the skeptical. Her disappearance remains one of the most puzzling unsolved cases in Pacific Northwest history. The official investigation, led by the Olympic National Forest Service and Washington State Police, covered over 50 square miles during an intensive 6-day search operation. Despite using helicopters, dog units, and dozens of experienced searchers, no trace of Cecilia's body was ever recovered. The case officially remains classified as a missing person investigation, though most investigators privately acknowledge that Cecilia is presumed dead. Her disappearance prompted significant changes in backcountry safety protocols, with park authorities now strongly recommending GPS tracking devices for solo hikers and requiring communication gear for researchers operating under official permits. Marcus has never stopped searching for his sister. He established a foundation dedicated to wilderness safety, which provides emergency communication equipment to researchers and maintains a database of unexplained wilderness encounters. Marcus continues to organize annual search expeditions, though he admits his focus has shifted from finding Cecilia to understanding what happened to her. 2 weeks after her disappearance, hiker David Chen discovered a cedar tree carving 3 miles deeper into the wilderness than any official search had reached. It showed the initials CM, followed by the words, "They're real," and "Tell the world," with an arrow pointing farther into the forest. Handwriting analysis strongly suggested Cecilia carved it, prompting an additional search in the surrounding area. No further evidence was ever recovered. This discovery raised more questions than it answered. Had Cecilia followed something into the forest? Was she trying to gather more evidence? Or had she been taken somewhere beyond the reach of conventional search efforts? The ultimate question remains. Did Cecilia Mangrove make the greatest scientific discovery of the 21st century, only to pay the ultimate price for her curiosity? Her case continues to inspire researchers, cryptozoologists, and adventurers who believe that somewhere in the vast Olympic wilderness, the truth about her final days is still waiting to be discovered. In the remote forests west of Forks, Washington, winter hides more than it reveals. In December 2017, a 9-year-old girl stepped into the snow to help something she thought was crying. By morning, she was gone, and what searchers found beside her footprints defied every simple explanation. It began just after dawn on December 27, 2017. A search alert went out for a missing 9-year-old girl from a rural property west of Forks, Washington. The temperature hovered near 25 degrees as rescue teams moved through heavy snow along a narrow creek corridor. Their footprints overlapped the child's small boot tracks that led away from the porch and down toward the frozen water. At first, everything looked routine. The prints were evenly spaced, the stride calm, the line direct. But halfway down the slope, rescuers noticed something unusual. Beside each boot impression were 2 smaller shapes pressed bare into the snow, flat, wide-toed, and human-like. They followed these parallel markings for nearly 40 yards before the wind began to erase their edges. The pattern suggested more than one presence, each step pacing perfectly beside the missing child. Near the creek bend, a single purple mitten clung to a low branch, and a camping lantern lay half buried in the drift below it. Its metal frame had frozen solid, the glass fogged with frost, as if it had been dropped mid-movement. The flannel blanket she'd carried the night before was never recovered. The scene felt paused between moments, evidence without motion, direction without conclusion. Investigators documented the area in silence. The only sounds were wind against the treetops and the brittle crack of ice shifting beneath the snow. From the porch to the waterline, there were exactly 3 sets of tracks, then nothing. Beyond the creek, the surface hardened into white glare where no print could hold. What began as a routine exposure case was already unraveling into something stranger. The simple disappearance of a child had left behind physical traces that refused to make sense. And before sunrise had fully broken over the tree line, those traces would become the foundation of one of the most disputed missing person cases in Washington's winter records. Hannah Coleman lived with her parents on the western edge of Forks, a logging town surrounded by dense evergreens and rain-cut ridges. The Colemans' property sat at the end of a gravel road where the forest began, only a few steps from their porch. From the kitchen window, the trees looked close enough to touch, dark and heavy, even in daylight. Her father, Alan Coleman, worked maintenance for a small equipment yard outside town. Her mother, Linda, spent most mornings at the local diner, finishing her shifts before sunset. Together they managed a quiet life built around routine: morning coffee, wood stacked by the shed, and the nightly hum of wind against the roof. Hannah was 9, an only child, and known in school for her curiosity more than her grades. She collected rocks, built small forts of sticks, and kept notebooks filled with sketches of animals she thought lived near the creek. Neighbors described her as gentle and fearless in the same breath, a child who wandered but never strayed too far. Her constant companions were 2 mixed-breed dogs, Duke and Molly, that followed her everywhere, except into the thicker part of the woods. December marked the coldest week of the year. A winter storm had settled over the Olympic Peninsula, dropping temperatures far below normal and warning of snow heavy enough to cut power across the region. The Colemans prepared the way most families did, stocking firewood, filling lanterns, and checking batteries. For them, isolation wasn't unusual. It was part of living at the forest's edge. The forest started 20 steps from their back door. That was where Hannah liked to play, between safety and wilderness, close enough to hear her mother call, but far enough for her imagination to run unguarded. It was a thin line, and in the final week of 2017, that line became the boundary no one would ever see her cross again. The evening before the disappearance began like any other winter night on the Coleman property. The wind pressed against the siding, and the lights inside flickered as another power surge passed through the valley. By 7 o'clock, the temperature had already dropped below freezing, and a faint hum from the generator carried through the trees. At some point after dinner, Hannah stood near the back window and stared toward the tree line. The snow outside reflected enough of the porch light to show faint movement near the creek. Later, her mother would remember her saying she saw two small figures crouched together in the snow, shaking, crying, and barely visible against the white ground. She called them babies, though no one took the description seriously. In a place surrounded by forest, stray animals weren't unusual. The adults returned to their routines, assuming Hannah had mistaken raccoons or young foxes for something human. But the image stayed with her. A few minutes later, she pulled an old flannel blanket from the laundry basket and took a granola bar from the pantry. Without a word, she stepped outside. The wind carried softly through the open door, then faded as the latch caught behind her. For several minutes, there was no movement except the faint glow of her lantern swaying along the first curve of the path. When she came back inside, the bottom of her boots was wet, and the hem of her coat carried small clumps of snow and grass. She said only that the babies were cold and that they had stopped crying. Her mother brushed it off, and the night went on. In that part of Washington, children were used to helping animals through rough weather. But what no one realized then was that this small act of kindness, a child stepping into the cold with a blanket and food, was the moment that connected her to something waiting beyond the reach of the porch light. It would be the last quiet evening her family ever spent together. Sometime after midnight, the temperature outside dropped even lower, and the Coleman house grew quiet except for the hum of the generator. The dogs began pacing across the living room, circling the door, their nails clicking softly on the wood. Every few minutes, they paused, ears tilted toward the tree line, reacting to something the adults couldn't hear. By 1 in the morning, the sound outside became more distinct. It wasn't the sharp cry of a coyote or the low wail of an owl, but a shorter, breathy sound that came in uneven intervals, halfway between a cough and a muffled whimper. The wind pushed against the walls and carried that sound through the thin spaces in the windows until it seemed to move from one side of the house to the other. At 2 o'clock, both dogs began scratching at the back door, agitated but unwilling to go out when it opened. The cold air that entered was sharp enough to sting. Beyond the porch, the forest looked motionless, only the faint movement of snow sweeping across the ground. The sound near the creek stopped as quickly as it had begun, replaced by the low rush of wind moving through the cedar branches. Inside, frost gathered along the corners of the window glass, forming patterns that spread like veins in the pale light. The clock on the wall ticked steadily in the background, counting down a night that felt longer than it should have been. By morning, the wind had eased. When Linda Coleman came into the kitchen around 6:30, the first thing she noticed was the cold air drifting through the hallway. The back door stood slightly open, snow dusting the threshold. The space where Hannah's boots had been was empty. For a few seconds, the quiet of the house felt wrong. Too still, too empty. The coffee pot sat untouched, the dogs whined near the doorway, and a faint draft moved across the floor. The day was just beginning, but whatever had happened outside during those dark hours had already taken shape. Hannah Coleman was gone. The first clear sign of direction came just after 7 that morning, when Alan Coleman followed a narrow line of prints away from the porch. The snow was fresh, compacted only by the light overnight wind. Each boot impression cut clean through the upper crust, spaced evenly and showing no sign of running or hesitation. For several yards, the trail carried a sense of purpose, straight, deliberate, and undisturbed. Halfway down the incline toward the creek, the pattern began to change. Beside the boot treads appeared 2 smaller sets of marks, bare and nearly symmetrical. Each showed the shape of a wide forefoot pressed into the snow, 5 shallow indentations at the front, but no sharp heel. The depth and spacing wavered slightly as the slope changed, too even to be random, yet too irregular to belong to anything walking with full human balance. Alan paused long enough to photograph the markings with his phone before the cold began to drain the battery. When rescuers arrived minutes later, they measured the impressions at just under 5 inches long, shallow but deeply outlined at the toes, as though made by something light but steady. The stride length was 18 inches, too short for an adult, too wide for a raccoon or fox. Every few steps, one of the smaller sets veered slightly toward the other, then corrected, as if the two forms had brushed together while walking. The tracks led down to the tree line, where the creek curved behind a tangle of alder and salal. Here the snow became brittle and uneven, refrozen over older ice. The prints pressed deeper in some places and disappeared in others, swallowed by thin air pockets beneath the crust. At the center of the path, a single purple mitten clung to a branch at waist height, its cuff frozen stiff. Below it, the snow dipped in a shallow oval, as though something small had crouched there before the surface hardened again overnight. Search and rescue established a perimeter shortly after 8 o'clock. Volunteers marked each print with colored flags to prevent accidental damage. Drones launched above the tree line, their cameras scanning for heat signatures through the thin fog rising from the creek. Radio chatter filled the silence, the short, clipped codes of trained responders, alternating with static as the signal broke against the ridge. The first thermal pass showed a mild heat anomaly beneath a pile of fallen logs near the far bank. The shape appeared faintly warmer than the surrounding ground, round at the edges and about the size of a person curled on their side. Teams rerouted toward the coordinates, cutting through brush where branches hung heavy with ice. When they reached the site, the air shimmered faintly, and a thin column of vapor lifted from a shallow hollow in the snow. The temperature contrast measured roughly 20 to 25 degrees above ambient and was already narrowing as rescuers took samples from the damp snow before it refroze. No animal hair or organic traces were recovered. Within 15 minutes, the hollow had cooled completely, leaving only a smooth depression in the crust and faint condensation clinging to the underside of the logs above it. For the rest of the morning, teams expanded the search in a grid, calling Hannah's name every 50 yards. The wind carried their voices up the slope and across the open stretch of trees, scattering sound before it could echo back. Dogs brought to the site followed the scent only to the creek's edge before circling aimlessly, confused by overlapping trails and refrozen layers. From the house to the waterline, investigators documented 3 distinct paths in the snow. 2 of them ended beneath the ice crust, where the surface had fractured into thin plates of frozen mud and runoff. The third stopped abruptly at the opposite bank, fading into hard glare where sunlight reflected too sharply to see detail. Beyond that point, there was nothing. No continuation, no exit, just unbroken white. 2 days before the disappearance, a wildlife researcher from the county had placed an automatic trail camera along the creek to monitor winter animal movement. The device was positioned on a narrow trunk about 4 feet above the ground, angled downward toward a bend in the water where animals often crossed between ridges. It used an infrared motion sensor programmed to capture short bursts of footage whenever something warm entered its range. When investigators later reviewed the memory card, they found images recorded on the night of December 26th, a little after 8 in the evening, the same hour Hannah had stepped outside with a blanket and a lantern. The first sequence appeared ordinary. Blown snow drifted past the lens in loose spirals, reflecting the faint infrared glow that gave the forest a pale metallic tone. Then, for 3 seconds, a new shape entered the frame from the left edge. It moved slowly, shoulders hunched, limbs close to its body. The outline was compact, no more than 4 feet in height, covered in a uniform blur of dark texture that matched the density of fur. The figure crouched near the edge of the water, lowered its head, and stayed still long enough for the camera to trigger a second capture. After that, the motion ended. When the wind picked up again, the shape was gone. Each image showed small differences. In one, the outline appeared rounded, almost spherical, as if the subject had drawn its knees close to its chest. In the next, a narrow form extended outward from the side of the body, something that resembled an arm or forelimb, long and thin, tapering near the joint. The limb appeared to reach toward the ice crust, and the reflection beneath it formed a faint double image. No eyes or facial detail were visible, only the gradient between the snow and the shadow. Investigators forwarded the footage to the State Wildlife Department for review. Analysts enhanced the exposure, slowed the frame rate, and measured proportions against known local species. The shape's mass and limb ratio did not correspond cleanly to any common animal recorded in the region. A fox standing upright would have shown a pointed muzzle and visible tail. A raccoon would have reflected more heat in the face and paws. Even a black bear cub, the largest possible comparison, would have produced a bulkier outline with distinct ear projections. What appeared in the frame fell somewhere between, slimmer than a bear, heavier than a marten, moving on all fours but balanced in an unusually vertical crouch. Skeptics pointed to optical distortion. Snow particles close to the lens can exaggerate movement, especially when the sensor refreshes between infrared bursts. In freezing air, the glow from heat differentials can create overlapping silhouettes where none exist. Some researchers suggested that two smaller animals might have crossed paths at once, their shapes blending in motion. Others believed the blurred limb was nothing more than wind-shaken brush catching the same reflected light. Forensic specialists extracted still frames to study pixel by pixel. Each image contained minor compression noise, a side effect of low-temperature operation. The lens temperature had dropped below freezing, creating a thin ring of condensation around the outer edge. Within that ring, the blur of the moving figure sharpened slightly at its center. When enlarged, faint parallel bands appeared across the body surface, possibly fur texture, though image noise or lens vibration could also explain them. The timestamp on the recording read 20:48:36, the same window when Hannah had last been seen at the back door holding a blanket. The match was close enough that investigators could estimate her location relative to the camera. Based on distance and angle, the figure would have been less than 60 yards from the Coleman property, hidden by brush and terrain elevation. That proximity raised the possibility that whatever the camera captured was the same presence Hannah had described earlier that evening. The footage circulated quietly among agencies for several weeks. Unofficial copies reached online discussion boards where viewers magnified frames and offered their own interpretations. Some saw two animals huddled together. Others insisted on the outline of a single, juvenile figure crouched low, its head proportionally larger than its body. When slowed to 1/4 speed, the movement pattern appeared deliberate. Slow exhalation creating visible vapor, a pause, and then retreat into the brush. Wildlife experts remained divided. One environmental biologist stated that juvenile martens can appear almost human-shaped when crouched and puffed with snow, their long tails hidden beneath them. Another analyst countered that the heat signature suggested a body temperature higher than expected for a small mammal in sub-freezing conditions. Both agreed that no definitive identification could be made. The camera's sensor recorded only shape and movement. Without color or detail, any conclusion would rely on assumption. When investigators revisited the site weeks later, they found no tracks matching the shape or position seen in the video. The area around the creek had thawed and refrozen several times, erasing whatever prints might have remained. They remounted the camera, hoping to capture further evidence, but no subsequent images showed anything comparable. The footage was ultimately archived with the case file labeled simply as Unidentified Thermal Subject, Sequence 17B. It lasted a total of 6 seconds. Frame 1 showed empty snow and wind. Frame 2, the dark shape entering. Frame 3, the crouch. Frame 4, the extension of an arm-like limb. There were no eyes, no face, and no definable outline beyond the faint curve of a spine and the suggestion of movement. It was neither proof nor illusion, just a record of something that existed for a moment between two gusts of wind. One motion frame later, it was gone. For investigators, the video represented both evidence and uncertainty, the only captured image that coincided exactly with Hannah Coleman's final known movements. To this day, it remains the most examined piece of material from the case, studied, argued, and interpreted without resolution. Each viewing offers the same realization. The camera had done its job, but what it saw defied ordinary explanation. News of Hannah Coleman's disappearance moved quickly through Forks. In a town that small, silence rarely lasted long. By mid-morning, word had passed from the rescue site to the gas station, and from there to the diner where her mother worked. Within hours, nearly everyone had a version of what might have happened, each story shifting slightly with retelling. Forks was used to bad weather, downed power lines, and lost hikers from the national forest, but a missing child within walking distance of town felt different. People came forward to help, loggers, retirees, and high school students on winter break. They formed search lines through the drainage gullies, carrying sticks to mark ground already covered. As they moved deeper into the woods, they began trading stories in low voices, small details that grew sharper with each repetition. One neighbor who lived along the access road said he had noticed movement the night before, two small shapes crossing the gravel near his mailbox just before midnight. He assumed it was a pair of stray dogs and went back inside. When the report reached investigators, they logged it as unconfirmed, the description too vague to pursue. Another resident who lived closer to the creek recalled hearing a series of high, clipped cries, not quite animal, but not recognizable as human either. He had shut his window and forgotten about it until the search began. At the elementary school, teachers gathered what information they could from Hannah's classmates. One of her friends mentioned that she had talked about finding new friends in the woods and that she had made a bed for them so they wouldn't freeze. The phrasing unsettled adults, but it was difficult to separate imagination from fact. Children in that age group often blurred the line between play and reality, especially when animals were involved. Still, the timing matched her disappearance too closely to ignore. By the end of the first week, the case had become a mixture of facts and folklore. Local hunters examined photographs of the strange footprints and debated whether they could have been caused by overlaid prints, one human, one animal, pressed together in soft snow. A retired tracker who joined the volunteer search said the spacing didn't match anything he recognized. The toes, he noted, were splayed wide, as if whatever made them had never worn shoes. But the proportions were wrong for a human child. The forefoot was too broad, the heel barely registered. As days passed without progress, theories multiplied. Some believed Hannah had wandered too far, slipped into the creek, and been carried downstream under the ice. Others pointed to rumors of wild animals drawn in by garbage bins left open after the power outage. One theory suggested she had followed strayed dogs into the woods and become disoriented in the storm. None of these explanations accounted for the bare, parallel tracks found beside hers, or the thermal reading under the fallen logs. The footage from the trail camera only added confusion. When the still frames reached the local paper, the editor published a single blurred image with the caption, "Unidentified figure near search zone." The community response was immediate. Some residents dismissed it as a trick of light, others treated it as proof that something unknown lived in the forest. Online discussions turned the story into a magnet for speculation. The idea of baby Bigfoots entered conversation not through witnesses, but through message boards repeating the same few sentences until they hardened into a kind of belief. For people who lived closest to the woods, the speculation carried an edge of fear. Parents kept children indoors after dark. Hunters avoided the lower creek crossings, not because they believed in creatures, but because they didn't want to stumble on what the search teams had missed. The Coleman property, once just another rural home, became a reference point whispered about in the diner or at the supply store, the place where the tracks had run side by side. Investigators continued to recheck the area, but every visit returned fewer answers. Snowfall melted and refroze, erasing impressions that might have clarified what had moved beside the child that night. With each passing day, the physical evidence faded, while the stories strengthened. Some spoke of seeing shapes between the trees at dusk, silhouettes moving in pairs. Others described faint cries echoing after dark when the wind dropped low across the valley. No two accounts matched exactly, yet none could be proven false either. By late January, the case had left the headlines, but the conversation persisted quietly. In the weeks that followed, people began leaving offerings near the creek: scraps of food, folded blankets, small toys. They said it was for Hannah, though others claimed it was for the things she had tried to help. What started as grief slowly blended with local superstition, a ritual shaped more by uncertainty than belief. Every town has a point where fact ends and story begins. For Forks, that point lay somewhere along the frozen bend of the creek. Everyone had a version: coyotes, runaways, barefoot teenagers, but none fit the size or the shape left in the snow. What remained was an absence that people filled with whatever explanation felt safest. In the end, the disappearance of one child had turned an ordinary patch of forest into a place defined entirely by what might still be hiding there. When official searches ended in early January, the Coleman case moved from rescue to review. The field teams were gone, but the evidence, what little existed, was still being measured and interpreted. By then, 4 main theories had formed. Each one attempted to explain what the snow, the camera footage, and the tracks could mean. None fit perfectly, but together they drew the limits of what was possible. The first and simplest explanation was that Hannah Coleman had wandered too far, become disoriented in the storm, and succumbed to cold. Exposure was the leading cause of death in winter disappearances across the Pacific Northwest. Conditions that morning supported it. The recorded temperature was 25 degrees Fahrenheit, with a steady wind chill that dropped it below 15. Within 30 minutes, bare skin could begin to lose coordination. After 2 hours, even mild hypothermia could lead to confusion and loss of direction. Search and rescue data from the region showed that children who leave home voluntarily often travel downhill or toward water, both of which matched the creek route on the Coleman property. The even spacing of her boot prints suggested calm, not panic, at least in the early stages of the walk. Investigators noted that children exposed to extreme cold sometimes remove clothing in later stages of hypothermia, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. If that occurred, it could explain the missing mitten and the disappearance of her coat. Yet the exposure theory faltered on one point: the parallel barefoot prints. No matter how confused a child might become, the presence of 2 separate, consistent sets of bare impressions alongside her own required an additional variable. Some argued they were distortions caused by melt-freeze cycles, where sun exposure during the day softens snow and refreezes it overnight, stretching edges outward to mimic toes. The pattern can make ordinary boot prints look wider or incomplete. Others believed that overlapping animal tracks could have produced the illusion. The exposure scenario remained the official position because it fit the timeline and the temperature data. It was logical, measurable, and free of speculation. But it left one question unanswered. If Hannah had simply wandered and collapsed nearby, why was no trace of her body ever recovered within the 10-mile radius that search teams covered repeatedly before the thaw? The second theory involved wildlife. Forks and the surrounding forest host, black bears, bobcats, foxes, and feral dogs, species capable of leaving ambiguous tracks in winter. The faint hand-like impressions near the creek might have belonged to a raccoon, which uses dexterous front paws for digging and feeding. When pressed into soft snow, those paws can create elongated marks that resemble fingers. Supporters of this view pointed to the sound reported during the night, short, breathy cries often associated with fox kits or martens during the mating season. A pair of juvenile animals sheltering under the logs could have generated the thermal anomaly later detected by the drone. If Hannah had followed those sounds to the creek, she might have attempted to reach them, fallen through thin ice, and been swept under the frozen surface. Wildlife specialists examined the evidence with caution. The size and spacing of the prints, at roughly 5 inches long and spaced 18 inches apart, didn't match raccoons or martens, whose 4-foot impressions are much smaller. Canine tracks typically show claw marks and symmetry absent from what was recorded. Moreover, the parallel nature of the prints suggested a bipedal gait, not the alternating pattern of four-legged movement. A senior tracker involved in the early phase of the search explained that snow can produce a double-step illusion. When two animals or 2 feet strike the same area within seconds, the overlapping pressure can merge outlines into a single distorted print. Over time, refreezing exaggerates the depth difference, creating the appearance of longer toes or wider heels. Photographs of the Coleman tracks displayed exactly those traits: deep leading edges and shallow rear imprints. To the untrained eye, they appeared human. To those familiar with snow behavior, they were ambiguous at best. While the animal interaction theory explained many details, it failed to account for the consistent pacing and direction of the prints. Wild animals rarely move in synchronized steps beside human tracks for more than a few feet. They wander, cross paths, or circle. In the Coleman case, the secondary prints remained beside hers for nearly 40 yards. That symmetry remained difficult to dismiss. The third theory was darker. Investigators briefly considered the possibility of a human perpetrator, someone who might have coaxed the child outside or intercepted her near the tree line. Cases of child abduction in rural Washington were rare, but not unheard of. The absence of adult boot prints complicated this idea, yet snow conditions could conceal evidence. If a second person had walked in her tracks or used snowshoes, impressions might not register distinctly. The open back door supported the notion of voluntary exit rather than forced removal. Hannah's blanket and lantern indicated preparation, not struggle. Those details suggested intent, as if she believed she was going to help someone or something. A human lure, perhaps a neighbor's child or an individual calling for assistance, could have drawn her toward the creek. Search teams, however, found no tire marks, footprints, or secondary evidence consistent with another person's involvement. No missing persons were reported in adjacent counties, and door-to-door interviews turned up nothing suspicious. The logistics of a human abduction under such conditions in heavy snow with active dogs on the property bordered on impossible. Even so, the theory persisted in conversation, sustained less by evidence than by the human tendency to seek agency behind tragedy. The final and least official theory emerged from within the volunteer search groups themselves. It was never listed in the report but circulated quietly among those who had seen the footprints and the trail camera footage. They referred to it simply as the unknown juvenile's hypothesis. According to this view, the smaller parallel tracks and the thermal image might have belonged to living creatures that were neither human nor known wildlife, young, fur-covered bipedal forms capable of limited coordination. The idea stemmed partly from proportion. The prints were shorter than an adult's, but displayed a stride consistent with upright movement. The thermal reading had shown a compact body heat, roughly equivalent to a small human curled under the logs. Combined, those two factors suggested size and warmth beyond what most animals of that weight could produce. Skeptics countered that body heat anomalies often occur near water channels where warm air escapes from underground flow. The hollow recorded by the drone might have been nothing more than trapped geothermal heat venting through the snow. Yet several searchers maintained that the hollow's shape appeared deliberate, oval, smooth, as if something had lain there recently. Meteorological data complicated the analysis. The storm that night included rapid shifts in wind direction, producing microdrifts capable of distorting snow surfaces within hours. That could explain why the prints seemed unusually preserved while everything else had blown over. But for others, those same conditions made the survival of detailed impressions improbable, unless they had been made shortly before discovery. The idea gained quiet traction when locals began pointing out that the Coleman property sat less than 15 miles from the Hoh River corridor, a region with a long history of unexplained sightings. Over the years, loggers and hikers had filed scattered reports of tall, upright figures moving through fog, strange vocalizations echoing along the Solduck River, and lines of wide, barefoot impressions discovered after fresh snow. In 1998, 2 hikers described a dark figure crossing a bend in the Solduck at dawn. In 2003, a retired ranger recorded a cluster of oversized prints deep in the Hoh drainage before later dismissing them as melt distortion. And in 2012, a road worker near Sappho heard 3 deep calls followed by heavy movement, downslope through brush. None of those reports had ever been verified, but they placed the Coleman case within a map of older stories stretching back decades. To some, the link felt unavoidable. If adults had seen full-grown figures, perhaps Hannah had encountered their young. To others, it was coincidence shaped by fear and memory. Either way, the geography supported the idea. The same valley, the same weather, and the same silence, thick enough to let imagination breathe. The unknown juvenile theory never advanced beyond speculation. It offered no verifiable evidence, no fur samples, no DNA, no consistent witness accounts. Still, it lingered because it accommodated all contradictions: the size of the tracks, the heat source, the missing body, and Hannah's own words about hairy babies crying by the creek. It was a theory that didn't need to be proven to feel complete. It simply occupied the gap left by everything the others failed to explain. By early spring of 2018, the official search for Hannah Coleman had long ended. The snow had melted from the lower valley, revealing empty ground where the search lines once stood. Investigators filed their final notes and reclassified the case as inactive, leaving the conclusion unchanged, presumed deceased due to exposure. It was the only answer that could be supported by evidence, even if it left more silence than certainty. The Coleman family moved away from Forks soon after. Their house remained empty for months, its windows dark, the porch steps marked by moss. The neighbors said little about the decision. No one blamed them for wanting to leave. The property sat too close to the waterline, too close to where the tracks had vanished, and too close to the questions that refused to settle. Life in the valley returned to rhythm, but the story didn't fade. Each winter, when the air grew sharp and the creek began to crust with ice again, people left small offerings along the path where the search had begun. Scraps of food, folded blankets, sometimes children's toys. Some said it was for Hannah, a gesture of remembrance. Others said it was for the things she had tried to help, the hairy babies that might still move quietly through the woods. Over time, the act became a kind of ritual, repeated without comment, part compassion and part caution. By the following winter, the property looked unchanged. The alder trees had grown thicker, the creek deeper from runoff. The only sign of visitation was a faded pink blanket tied around a branch near the bend, a piece of fabric, sun-bleached and frayed, fluttering lightly in the wind. It stayed there through rain and frost, visible from the trail, but never disturbed. The file on Hannah Coleman remains open in name only. There were no new leads, no confirmed sightings, and no further evidence recovered from the creek. But the photographs of the prints and the 6 seconds of trail cam footage still circulate among those who remember. They study the same frames again each year, hoping that something hidden inside them will suddenly make sense. Nothing ever changes. Whatever Hannah found that night, she saw something worth helping. Whether it was wildlife, imagination, or something science hasn't yet named, only the snow remembers how close she walked beside it. In 1947, Thomas was brutally captured and forced to live with Bigfoot for over 40 years before the FBI found out and had to make a horrifying decision. The effects of being Bigfoot's roommate were truly mortifying. And what state they found Thomas in is even worse. This is the terrifying story of how Thomas Garrett lived with Bigfoot. The creatures had been waiting for Thomas when he first ventured into the Cascade Mountains in 1947, as if they'd chosen him specifically for reasons he would never fully understand. From his first night in the wilderness, massive shapes had surrounded his camp, beings that stood nearly 9 feet tall and moved with an intelligence that was unmistakably predatory. They hadn't attacked him, but they'd made their intentions clear through gestures and vocalizations that carried an unmistakable message. He belonged to them now. The creatures had herded him deeper into the wilderness, away from any hope of rescue, to a place where human rules no longer applied, and their ancient laws governed every aspect of existence. The beings Thomas came to know as his captors operated according to a social structure that was both primitive and sophisticated, with hierarchies based on size, age, and something he could only describe as psychic dominance. The largest among them, a massive patriarch that Thomas privately called the Elder, seemed to possess an intelligence that rivaled human cognition while remaining utterly alien in its motivations. This creature had claimed Thomas as a prize, a living specimen to be studied, used, and ultimately broken through decades of psychological manipulation that would leave scars deeper than any physical wound. Thomas's daily existence became a carefully orchestrated routine of servitude and observation, with the creatures using him as both a tool and an experiment in human endurance. They forced him to build structures using techniques they demonstrated through intimidation and violence, construction methods that required him to work alongside beings whose strength could crush him without effort. The cabin that would later puzzle investigators had been built under constant supervision, with Thomas serving as the architect while his captors provided the impossible physical labor that no human could have accomplished alone. When he attempted to resist their demands, they would withhold food for days, leaving him weak and compliant. The creature's interest in Thomas went beyond simple curiosity about human behavior. They seemed to be conducting a long-term study of human adaptation under extreme psychological pressure. They would disappear for days at a time, leaving him alone with the illusion of freedom, only to return when he began to hope for escape. These psychological games became more sophisticated over the years, with the beings learning to manipulate his emotions and responses with a precision that suggested they understood human psychology better than most humans did themselves. They would allow him brief glimpses of the outside world, forcing him to make supervised trips to town for supplies, always with the unspoken threat that any attempt to seek help would result in consequences too terrible to imagine. The first reports of unusual activity around Thomas's property began surfacing in the early 1950s, when loggers working nearby claims started describing encounters that made them question their sobriety. They spoke of massive shapes moving through the trees at dawn, sounds that resembled human conversation, but in voices too deep and resonant to belong to any person. Equipment would be moved overnight, arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random animal interference. Most disturbing were the gifts, carved wooden objects and arrangements of stones that appeared near their camps, crafted with a skill that implied hands far larger than human, but possessing an artistic sensibility that seemed designed to mock human attempts at creativity. The creature's communication with Thomas evolved from simple gestures to a complex system of sounds and symbols that he was forced to learn under threat of starvation or violence. They seemed fascinated by human language, often forcing him to repeat words and phrases while they attempted to mimic the sounds with vocal cords that weren't designed for human speech. These sessions would last for hours, with Thomas serving as an unwilling teacher in a classroom where failure to cooperate resulted in punishment that left him broken and terrified. Food became a weapon of control, with the creatures providing sustenance that kept Thomas alive, but dependent on their generosity. They would bring him fruits, vegetables, and nuts, gathered from locations he could never find on his own, always in quantities that reminded him of his helplessness. When he attempted to hunt or forage independently, they would sabotage his efforts, destroying his traps and scaring away game until he learned that survival depended entirely on their whims. His supervised shopping trips to town reflected this forced diet: massive amounts of raw vegetables, fruits, and nuts, but very little meat or processed food, creating a shopping pattern that puzzled store owners. The transformation in Thomas's appearance over the years became a source of whispered speculation among the few locals who encountered him during his rare, supervised visits to town. By the 1960s, something had changed in fundamental ways that went beyond simple aging. His posture had become more upright and confident, his movements more fluid and purposeful, but there was something broken in his eyes that suggested a man who had learned to survive by surrendering his humanity piece by piece. His hands had grown larger and more powerful from the constant manual labor the creatures demanded, while his vocal patterns had changed to incorporate sounds that seemed designed to communicate with his captors. As the years passed, Thomas began to understand that he wasn't the first human the creatures had captured. Evidence throughout their territory suggested a long history of contact with people who had ventured too deep into the wilderness and never returned. Personal belongings from missing hikers and campers were displayed like trophies in hidden caves, arranged with a care that suggested the creatures valued these remnants of their previous captives. The implications were horrifying. Thomas was part of a pattern that stretched back generations, a tradition of human collection that the creatures had refined over decades of practice. The creatures' treatment of Thomas became more sophisticated as they learned to exploit his psychological vulnerabilities with surgical precision. They would withhold social contact for weeks at a time, leaving him in complete isolation until he began to crave even their alien presence. When they finally returned, Thomas would find himself grateful for their attention, a response that horrified him even as he found himself unable to resist the conditioning they had imposed through decades of careful manipulation. Physical changes in Thomas became more pronounced as the years of captivity took their toll on his body and mind. His hands grew larger and more powerful from the constant manual labor the creatures demanded, while his posture adapted to walking alongside beings whose stride length was nearly twice his own. Most disturbing was the way his vocal patterns began to incorporate sounds and frequencies that seemed designed to communicate with his captors, as if his very humanity was being slowly eroded by prolonged exposure to their alien influence. The creatures' interest in human reproduction became apparent when they began bringing Thomas into contact with other captives, women who had been taken from hiking trails and camping sites across the Pacific Northwest. These encounters were brief and traumatic, with Thomas realizing that the creatures were attempting to breed humans like livestock, studying the results of their experiments with a clinical detachment that revealed the true depth of their alien nature. The fate of these women and any children that might have resulted from these forced encounters remained a mystery that would haunt Thomas for the rest of his life. Government interest in the creature's territory began in the late 1970s, when satellite imagery revealed anomalies that couldn't be explained by conventional analysis. The forest around Thomas's prison showed patterns of growth and development that suggested systematic cultivation, with clearings arranged in geometric shapes that appeared too regular to be natural. Thermal imaging detected heat signatures that indicated a population far larger than one hermit could account for, with movement patterns that suggested a community living according to organized social structures. The creatures seemed aware of this increased government attention, becoming more cautious in their movements and more aggressive in their control of Thomas. They began forcing him to help them develop countermeasures against human technology, using his knowledge of electronics and communication systems to create interference patterns that would confuse government monitoring equipment. Thomas found himself trapped between his desire to escape and his terror of what the creatures would do to him if they discovered any attempt at betrayal. Intelligence agencies had been quietly monitoring the region since the early days of the Cold War, initially suspecting that Thomas might be involved in espionage or illegal weapons development. Surveillance teams reported encounters that challenged their training and experience, describing beings of enormous size that moved through the forest with intelligence and purpose that defied classification as wildlife. These creatures seemed aware of the surveillance efforts and would occasionally leave messages for the watchers, arrangements of stones and branches that conveyed meaning through symbolism that no government analyst could decode. The decision to investigate Thomas's property came after decades of accumulating evidence that something unprecedented was occurring in those remote mountains. Intelligence agencies had been monitoring reports of unusual activity in the region since the 1950s, documenting encounters that followed patterns too consistent to dismiss as folklore or misidentification. Witnesses described beings of enormous size and obvious intelligence, living in organized communities that operated according to social structures that predated human civilization. The planning for the raid involved multiple agencies and months of preparation as officials struggled to develop protocols for a situation that had no precedent in law enforcement history. Psychological profiles of Thomas suggested a man who had undergone fundamental changes that went beyond normal human adaptation to wilderness living. Someone who might have developed loyalties that transcended national boundaries or even species identification. The final decision to proceed with the raid came from the highest levels of government, driven by concerns that Thomas's situation represented a potential security threat that could no longer be ignored. The creature's preparations for potential human contact revealed a level of strategic thinking that challenged everything Thomas thought he knew about their intelligence. They had been observing human society for generations, learning about military tactics, government operations, and technological capabilities through captured individuals like himself. Their hidden communities throughout the mountains were connected by communication networks that used natural acoustics to coordinate responses to any threat, with Thomas serving as both an intelligence asset and a potential bargaining chip. Thomas's role in the creature's society evolved from captive to reluctant collaborator as they began to rely on his knowledge of human psychology and behavior. They would consult him before making decisions that might affect their interactions with the outside world, treating him as an advisor while never allowing him to forget that his life depended entirely on their continued tolerance. This position gave him access to information about their long-term plans, including contingency strategies for dealing with government investigation and potential relocation to even more remote territories. The breakthrough that would eventually lead to Thomas's escape came when the creatures began experiencing internal conflicts over how to handle the increasing human presence in their territory. Younger members of their community advocated for more aggressive responses to government surveillance, while older individuals preferred the traditional approach of remaining hidden and avoiding contact. These disagreements created opportunities for Thomas to exploit as he began to understand the political dynamics that governed their society and the ways he might use their divisions to his advantage. The creature's decision to relocate deeper into the wilderness provided Thomas with the opportunity he had been waiting for decades to exploit. During the chaos of moving their entire community through underground tunnel systems, Thomas managed to slip away from his guards and begin the desperate journey back to human civilization. The escape took weeks, with Thomas navigating through terrain that had been deliberately altered to confuse and disorient anyone attempting to leave their territory without permission. He survived on roots and berries, avoiding the main trails where he knew the creatures would be searching for him, following streams and ridgelines that he hoped would eventually lead him back to the world he had been stolen from 40 years earlier. The physical toll of his escape nearly killed Thomas before he reached civilization, his body weakened by decades of captivity and the stress of his desperate flight through the wilderness. He had lost nearly 50 pounds by the time he stumbled out of the forest, his clothes hanging in tatters and his mind barely able to process the reality that he was finally free. The first humans he encountered, hikers on a popular trail, were so frightened by his appearance that they initially fled, thinking he was some kind of wild man or dangerous vagrant. It took hours of patient explanation before they agreed to help him reach the authorities. And even then, they seemed skeptical of his claims about what had happened to him in the mountains. Thomas's arrival at the FBI field office in Seattle marked the end of a nightmare that had consumed 40 years of his life, but also the beginning of a new kind of captivity as government agents struggled to process his incredible story. The physical evidence he provided, photographs, artifacts, and detailed maps of the creature's territory, corroborated his account in ways that forced investigators to confront the possibility that something unprecedented was living in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest. His detailed knowledge of government surveillance techniques and military tactics, information he could only have obtained through his forced cooperation with the creatures, convinced even the most skeptical agents that his story contained elements of truth that couldn't be dismissed. The morning of the raid, federal agents approached Thomas's abandoned cabin, expecting to find evidence that would either confirm or debunk his incredible claims. Instead, they discovered a property that challenged their understanding of what was possible for a single human being to accomplish under duress. The main cabin had been expanded over the years into a complex of interconnected structures, built with architectural techniques that seemed to blend human engineering with construction methods that appeared in no textbook. The buildings showed evidence of occupancy by beings of vastly different sizes, with doorways and furniture scaled for both human proportions and creatures that would have to stand nearly 9 feet tall. Inside the cabin, investigators found living spaces that told the story of captivity rather than voluntary cohabitation. Multiple sleeping areas had been constructed, some sized for human occupants and others clearly designed for much larger beings. The kitchen contained cooking implements and storage systems that could accommodate the dietary needs of Thomas's captors, with evidence of food preparation techniques that combined human methods with practices that seemed to originate from an entirely different culinary tradition. Most intriguing were the books and documents found throughout the property. Journals written in Thomas's handwriting, but containing symbols and languages that no linguist could identify, alongside what appeared to be maps of underground tunnel systems that extended for miles beneath the surrounding mountains. The search of Thomas's property revealed evidence of technological capabilities that the creatures had forced him to develop in their remote location. Solar panels and wind generators provided power for a sophisticated communication system that included radio equipment capable of reaching frequencies that weren't supposed to be accessible to civilian operators. Computer equipment, primitive by modern standards but advanced for its time, contained files that documented decades of observations about wildlife behavior, weather patterns, and geological activity in the region. But the most compelling discovery was a collection of photographs that showed Thomas in the company of beings that science insisted didn't exist. Massive, hair-covered humanoids that displayed obvious intelligence and what appeared to be complete dominance over their human captive. The photographic evidence found in Thomas's cabin documented a relationship that had evolved over decades, from initial capture to reluctant cooperation under duress. Early images showed Thomas as a younger man, clearly terrified and uncertain, standing at a considerable distance from massive figures that loomed threateningly in the shadows. Later photographs revealed growing submission and compliance, with Thomas eventually appearing in staged portraits alongside beings of various sizes, including what appeared to be juveniles and elderly individuals. The final photographs in the collection showed Thomas participating in ceremonies and activities that seemed to blend human and non-human traditions, suggesting that he had been forced to integrate into a society that operated according to rules unknown to the outside world. The basement of Thomas's cabin contained discoveries that would be classified by government agencies and never released to the public. Archaeological artifacts suggested that the area had been continuously inhabited for thousands of years, with evidence of a civilization that had developed along entirely different lines from human society. Tools and weapons showed craftsmanship that exceeded anything produced by known indigenous cultures, made from materials that didn't match the local geology and using techniques that seemed to require both enormous strength and incredible precision. Most disturbing were the human artifacts mixed among these alien objects, personal items that belonged to missing persons from across the Pacific Northwest, suggesting that Thomas's captors had been collecting humans from the outside world for generations. The investigation team's attempts to track the creatures' whereabouts led them deeper into the mountains, following trails that seemed to have been deliberately obscured but still showed signs of recent use by multiple large beings. The footprints they discovered matched those found around missing person cases dating back decades, but the patterns suggested organized hunting rather than random encounters. GPS equipment malfunctioned in certain areas, compasses spun wildly, and radio communication became impossible, as if the forest itself was actively interfering with their technology. Several team members reported feeling watched throughout their search, and motion-activated cameras they left behind captured images of massive shapes moving through the trees with an intelligence and purpose that challenged everything they thought they knew about wildlife behavior. The deeper the investigation team ventured into the wilderness, the more they encountered evidence of a sophisticated infrastructure that had been hidden beneath the forest canopy for generations. Ancient trails connected clearings that showed signs of regular use by large communities, with evidence of sustainable resource management that had maintained the forest's health while supporting a significant population of predators. Underground water systems had been engineered to provide clean drinking water throughout the territory, using techniques that seemed to work in harmony with natural hydrology rather than disrupting it. Most remarkably, the team discovered what appeared to be a communication network that used natural acoustics to carry messages across vast distances, with strategically placed rock formations that could amplify and direct sound waves through the mountains. The search for the creatures extended over several weeks, covering hundreds of square miles of wilderness that seemed to shift and change in ways that defied topographic maps. Helicopter overflights revealed structures hidden beneath the forest canopy, buildings that appeared to be constructed from living trees, shaped and guided rather than cut and assembled. These structures formed a network throughout the mountains, connected by paths that were invisible from ground level but clearly visible from above, suggesting a transportation system that had been developed over generations. The pilots reported equipment malfunctions when flying over certain areas, with instruments failing and engines running rough, as if something was actively discouraging aerial observation. The few witnesses who came forward during the investigation told stories that painted a picture of Thomas as a victim rather than a willing participant in whatever was happening in the mountains. Local indigenous elders spoke of him as someone who had been chosen against his will to serve as a bridge between worlds, forced to facilitate communication between human civilization and something that preferred to remain hidden while preying upon it. They described encounters with Thomas over the years, where he had appeared increasingly desperate and broken, serving as an unwilling translator and mediator in conflicts between their communities and the forest dwellers who had been there long before European settlement. The investigation took a dramatic turn when team members began experiencing encounters that challenged their understanding of what was possible in the modern world. Equipment would be moved overnight, arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence and perhaps even mockery, as if unseen observers were demonstrating their superiority over the human searchers. Food supplies would disappear only to be replaced with wild edibles that had been prepared and arranged with obvious care and skill, but also with an undertone of threat that suggested the creatures could provide or withhold sustenance at will. Most unsettling were the sounds that echoed through the forest at night, vocalizations that resembled human speech, but in frequencies and patterns that suggested vocal cords far larger than any person possessed, carrying on conversations in languages that predated known human communication. The psychological effects on the investigation team became increasingly pronounced as their search continued, with several members reporting dreams and visions that seemed more real than waking life. These experiences always featured the same elements: vast underground cities carved from living rock, technologies that operated on principles beyond human understanding, and beings of enormous size and obvious intelligence who watched the searchers with expressions that conveyed both curiosity and predatory intent. Some team members began to question their mission, wondering whether they were investigating a threat to national security or walking into a trap that had been set by something far more intelligent than they had anticipated. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators discovered Thomas's personal journals, hidden in a cache that had been sealed with techniques that required both human intelligence and non-human strength to access. The journals documented 40 years of captivity with beings that Thomas referred to as the Old Ones, creatures that had inhabited the Pacific Northwest for millennia before human arrival. His entries described a gradual process of psychological breaking and forced adaptation, beginning with terrifying encounters and evolving into reluctant cooperation born of desperation and the will to survive. The journals revealed that Thomas had been chosen not randomly, but because of specific qualities that made him suitable for serving as an unwilling liaison between species that had been capturing humans from civilization for centuries. Thomas's writings described a society that operated according to principles that challenged human assumptions about intelligence, technology, and social organization. The beings he lived with had developed sustainable technologies that worked in harmony with natural systems, creating communities that could exist for generations without depleting their environment. But they used this knowledge to maintain their dominance over captured humans. They possessed knowledge of medicine, agriculture, and engineering that far exceeded human capabilities in some areas, while remaining deliberately primitive in others. Most remarkably, they had maintained detailed records of human development over centuries, watching and occasionally intervening in ways that had influenced the course of history without ever revealing their presence. The final entries in Thomas's journals, written during his desperate escape through the wilderness, revealed the true horror of his 4 decades in captivity and his growing realization that he might be the only human who had ever successfully escaped their control. He wrote about the impossible choice between remaining a captive and risking everything in an attempt to reach civilization, describing the terror of knowing that recapture would result in punishment worse than death. His final words spoke of a responsibility to warn humanity about the predators that lived in the shadows of civilization, beings that viewed humans as nothing more than specimens to be collected, studied, and ultimately consumed. The area around Thomas's former prison was quietly designated as a protected wilderness zone, with access restricted under environmental protection laws that were actually designed to prevent further contact with whatever lived in those mountains. Satellite monitoring of the region continues to this day, showing activity patterns that suggest the creatures are still there, still hunting, still collecting humans who venture too deep into their domain. Thomas remains in protective custody, his testimony classified at the highest levels of government, but his warnings about the predators that live in the wilderness have become part of the folklore whispered among those who understand that some secrets are too dangerous for civilization to acknowledge. The legacy of Thomas Garrett serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers that lurk in the spaces between the known and unknown, a reminder that humanity's dominance over the natural world may be nothing more than an illusion, maintained by creatures intelligent enough to remain hidden while they hunt. His 40 years of captivity revealed the existence of a predatory intelligence that has been operating in the shadows of human civilization for generations, collecting specimens and studying their prey with the patience of beings who measure time in centuries rather than years. The mountains remain quiet now, but those who know the truth understand that the silence is not empty. It's waiting for the next human to venture too deep into territories where ancient predators still claim dominion over all who enter their realm. On June 15, 2015, a mother from Oklahoma called 911, her house torn apart. Doors splintered, massive handprints gouged into the siding, and her daughter attacked. What followed would be one of the most disputed Bigfoot-related disappearances ever on reservation land. Anita Graywolf, 39, was a social worker from Tulsa who had spent most of her life listening to other people's stories and learning how to separate fear from fact. After years in the city, she decided to return with her daughter, Maya, to the family property on the southeastern border of the Cherokee Reservation, a place her grandparents had once warned her never to disturb. For Anita, the move felt like both an escape and a responsibility, to remind her daughter where she came from, unaware that the valley they were returning to had been waiting for them. The land sat beside Hollow Valley, a stretch of forest that Anita remembered only through half-forgotten warnings from her grandparents. The stories she said she knew had always been about the Stone Man, a guardian spirit said to rise when people disturbed the balance of the old ground. Anita had once laughed at those tales. Now, standing in the quiet clearing, she found herself uneasy at how easily the valley swallowed sound. She said that when she announced her plans to stay for the summer, the tribal elders' concern unsettled her more than she admitted. They told her the Stone Man walks when people forget him, and that Hollow Valley remembers what was taken from it. She wanted to believe their tone was ceremonial, but there was something in their eyes that lingered after the conversation ended. She later learned their worry had roots in the past. In the 1950s, a limestone quarry had been cut directly into ground, once used for Cherokee burials and ceremonies. The elders said the land had never settled after that. But was it merely a story meant to preserve respect, or a warning too old to be ignored? Her skepticism would have felt firmer if she had known nothing of the missing person cases that surrounded the valley. For decades, rumors had circulated about disappearances quietly erased from tribal police files. The idea sounded impossible, but something about that absence, what wasn't on paper, bothered her. Why were those records erased, and by whom? By the time she and Maya arrived in early June 2015, Anita said that she was determined to treat the trip as a family experiment rather than a spiritual one. She had no reason to think the valley would challenge her sense of what was real. Maya, eager for a project, began recording interviews with elders for what she called a folklore study. Anita mentioned to investigators that she encouraged it, proud of her daughter's initiative. The drawings Maya made afterward, tall figures covered in moss with eyes like polished stone, struck Anita as creative exaggerations. So why did Maya's drawings start to match what others had described decades earlier? When Maya reviewed her recordings, she mentioned a faint pulsing sound that repeated through every clip filmed near the tree line. Anita assumed it was interference, maybe a faulty microphone. Later analysis by others would suggest the frequencies resembled those produced by large mammals, but at the time, Anita dismissed it without hesitation. The first thing she couldn't dismiss came from the dogs. They refused to cross the clearing that bordered the forest, bracing their legs and whining whenever she tried to lead them forward. Even food couldn't persuade them. Their bodies went rigid, muscles trembling, eyes fixed on the dark edge of the trees, as though something waited just beyond sight. Anita compared this animal reaction to what she had seen in trauma survivors: instinctive, unreasoned, absolute. She wrote it off at first as a remnant of travel stress, but over the next 2 days, the dogs grew worse, pacing the porch at night and refusing to leave the steps, even to relieve themselves. On June 8th, she and Maya began hearing slow, deliberate impacts from the direction of the valley. 3 strikes, always in sequence, then silence. The sound was heavy, like wood on wet earth, each blow separated by an unnatural stillness. Anita kept count in a small notebook, treating each sound like a case note, noting the intervals and time of day. Sometimes the noises came after dusk, other times at dawn when the air was completely still. She wondered if stress or isolation had made her hypersensitive to noise, but the dogs would react first, heads lifting moments before she heard it. 4 days later, Maya filmed a short interview with her on the porch, a casual talk about family heritage and why they'd returned. The atmosphere felt peaceful, though Anita noticed the quiet had changed in a subtle way, the absence of birds, the stillness of leaves. She remembered the light that afternoon, bright, steady, the woods behind her unmoving in the heat. Maya had laughed easily, asking about old stories their grandmother used to tell. Everything about that hour seemed ordinary until later that night, when Maya replayed the footage. When she did, she froze. At the 18-minute mark, behind where Anita had been sitting, a tall figure stood between the trees. It did not move. The shape was dark, featureless but clearly solid, the upper outline distinct against the lighter canopy. Anita thought it might have been a shadow at first, some play of light through shifting branches, but the figure remained fixed while the camera trembled slightly in Maya's hands. Frame-by-frame review showed it remained visible for nearly 4 minutes before vanishing between one frame and the next. By tree measurements, it stood more than 8 feet tall. Its limbs appeared long, almost disproportionate, the posture too upright for a bear and too broad for a man. Anita watched the footage twice, then a third time, unable to decide whether she was seeing a trick of light or the shape the elders had warned about. The one said to appear first at a distance, always watching, never retreating. She turned off the laptop and told Maya to delete the file, but by then it had already been copied to her phone. The question that lingered after the screen went dark wasn't what it was. Investigators later asked, how does something that large vanish in a single frame? According to reports, word of Maya's footage spread quickly through the tribal community, reaching Anita before she was ready to face the attention it brought. 2 Cherokee police officers arrived the next afternoon, requesting copies of the recording. Anita watched them move methodically through the property, examining the area where the figure had stood. They pointed to the impressions in the soft earth near the tree line, indentations she had stepped around for days without realizing their significance. Plaster casts were made of several 16-inch footprints that revealed a strange, asymmetrical gait. Anita noticed how the impressions sank deeply at both heel and toe, suggesting something heavy yet balanced, as though whatever made them could move with its full weight upright. The stride between each print measured nearly 4 feet. To her, it looked like a pattern that belonged to neither man nor bear, but something that walked like both. Despite the documentation, the casts were gone within days. Anita learned that Wildlife Management had taken possession of them, though she did say that she never saw any paperwork confirming that transfer. When she later asked for the case number, the files had already disappeared from the record. What remained were Maya's photographs, the only proof that the prints had existed at all. That night, the rhythmic knocking resumed. Anita marked 3 distinct impacts in her notebook, followed by a deep, dragging exhalation that seemed to press through the bedroom wall. It was the first time she admitted to herself that she was frightened, though she forced her mind to frame it as data. Something to be cataloged, not feared. The disturbances were escalating. Anita felt a growing certainty that their arrival had disrupted something old and watchful, something that had waited for acknowledgement. The Stone Man legend was no longer folklore whispered by elders. It was pressing against her reality. By the second week of June, the property had taken on the atmosphere of a siege. The nighttime sounds followed a strict schedule, every night between 2:45 and 3:10. Anita said that she would wake to 3 heavy knocks from different sides of the house, then silence, then guttural calls that vibrated through the walls with physical force. She documented each sequence, her digital recorder filling with data she could neither explain nor dismiss. When wildlife officers arrived to analyze the recordings, their report only deepened her confusion. The sounds matched no known species in the region and registered at decibel levels, suggesting immense lung capacity. One officer remarked that the calls appeared to be directed toward the Gray Wolf residence, as if in response to something within it. Anita replayed that observation in her head for nights afterward, wondering if something in the valley recognized them specifically. But if it wanted contact, why did it never approach openly? Alongside the sounds came an odor so pungent it seemed alive, a mixture of wet earth and decomposition that saturated the air and vanished at sunrise. Anita noted its presence during every nocturnal disturbance. Maya, increasingly distressed, began sleeping with towels under her door to block the smell, complaining that it caused nausea and headaches. On June 12th, Anita told investigators that she found the chicken coop destroyed at dawn. The wooden frame had collapsed inward, boards splintered, but unmarked by claw or bite. There were no tracks in the surrounding dirt, no drag signs, no sign of struggle. The chain-link fencing had been crushed from above as if something immense had dropped onto it. The force required to break the wooden posts at ground level seemed beyond any natural animal. Yet the scene bore no mechanical evidence, no tire marks, no tool impressions. The 6 chickens lay arranged in a straight line 20 feet from the coop. Each neck was broken cleanly, the bodies otherwise untouched. Anita stood over them for several minutes, struck by the absence of chaos. Whatever had done this, it had acted with purpose. 3 days later, during a survey of the property line, she noticed several mature oaks near the abandoned quarry, stripped of bark in clean vertical lines reaching 8 feet up the trunks. The sap was still fresh. When forestry officials inspected the damage, they found no evidence of tools. The bark had been removed in single, fluid motions that implied immense leverage or precision. Reports from nearby ranchers followed the next morning. Deer carcasses had begun appearing in semicircular patterns across the valley, all facing the forest. Anita noted how consistent the arrangement sounded, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The animals showed no sign of disease or predation, their bodies unmarked and intact. Veterinary exams revealed no physiological cause of death. The symmetry of it unsettled her more than the images themselves. Who or what had arranged them with such deliberate symmetry? Technological interference intensified as the pattern continued. Trail cameras deployed by wildlife officers failed within a day, their storage cards corrupted or blank. One managed to capture 6 seconds of usable footage before malfunctioning. When Anita reviewed the clip at the tribal office, she saw a massive silhouette pass close to the lens, so near that the frame blurred from motion. The shape filled the entire shot, yet no features could be discerned. Watching it, she felt the same weight in her chest she had felt that first night, the sense that something vast was studying them in return. The silhouette footage became a point of fixation for researchers, but for Anita, it was something far worse, a confirmation that what had been circling their property had form and intent. Frame-by-frame analyses circulated among cryptozoology circles, showing what appeared to be a bipedal figure of immense proportion with an unnatural gait. She watched those frames repeatedly, noting how the creature seemed to pause and turn toward the camera before the image collapsed into static, as though it had known it was being observed. Anita's documentation changed with that realization. Her once clinical notes, precise and organized, began to unravel into chaotic bursts of handwriting. The early entries were still careful: times, durations, temperature readings, notes about light and sound direction. By mid-June, her writing had become fragmented and urgent, whole lines underlined in heavy strokes, some entries reduced to single declarative phrases written in all capitals, the handwriting trembling with exhaustion and dread. The entry, dated June 14th, stood out most starkly in her own recollection. "It knows we're watching. The sounds are getting closer." Maya drew another picture. Today, how does she know what it looks like? She had not intended to write in that tone, but by then she said that her thoughts had ceased to feel like her own. Maya's sketches were growing disturbingly detailed. Anita noticed the anatomical precision in her daughter's depictions. The elongated limbs, the vast chest, the strange curvature of the shoulders. The eyes in the drawings seemed to hold the page, pale and deliberate, as if some shared vision had guided the pencil. Maya had never seen the creature directly, yet her renderings captured something that made Anita's stomach tighten whenever she looked too long. Anita began to believe the creature was asserting itself, responding to their presence. It moved with deliberation, leaving signs and signals that felt territorial. The Gray Wolf property had become the center of a confrontation decades in the making, and Anita sensed they were now a part of whatever unfinished pattern the valley had been holding. By June 13th, the boundary between observation and participation had dissolved completely. They were no longer witnesses. They were being engaged. The rhythmic pounding that had once seemed distant now shook the entire structure, causing light fixtures to sway and glass to hum in the window panes. Electrical power failed in unison with the pounding, as though each impact drained the air and current at once. The darkness that followed was total, broken only by the pulse of sound surrounding the house in coordinated patterns. But how could something that large perform those without leaving tracks? Her skepticism collapsed quietly rather than dramatically. She now slept on the couch facing the entryway, a claw hammer resting beside her. She positioned herself between the door and Maya's room, sleeping only in short intervals, ears trained on every shift in the wind. Each thud outside felt calculated, as if the thing circling them was not just testing boundaries, but studying them. Maya changed with the pattern of nights. She spoke less, drew more. Her notebooks filled with sequences of the same towering figure, sometimes at the edge of the woods, sometimes half obscured by branches, always turned toward the house. Her focus became unnervingly precise. She would stay awake for hours sketching in silence, her pencil tracing shapes Anita could almost hear. When the wildlife biologists arrived, Anita's hope returned for the first time in weeks. A 3-person team from the Department of Conservation, led by Dr. Ellis Crane, set up on her porch, their confidence measured and professional. Maya recorded the session for her project, while Anita presented her notes, her tone steady as she explained each incident. The destroyed coop, the stripped trees, the symmetrical animal carcasses. She placed her journal before them, offering data she had spent sleepless nights compiling, hoping science might impose structure on the chaos. The scientists' response struck her harder than the knocking ever had. Their calm detachment felt rehearsed. Dr. Crane mentioned isolation hysteria, describing how sensory deprivation could distort perception. His colleague, Dr. Leora Vance, spoke of bacterial infections and environmental contamination, though she admitted that all samples tested clean. Their dismissal of the electromagnetic failures drew the faintest smile from Crane, as though the notion itself insulted his expertise. To Anita, the condescension felt colder than disbelief. That night, their team established a base camp half a mile from the Gray Wolf house. Anita watched their lights fade behind the trees, the equipment glinting under the beam of their headlamps. Motion sensors, infrared rigs, field recorders, electromagnetic detectors arranged with precision and purpose. They moved with the confidence of people who still believed the world was explainable. At 2:30 in the morning, Anita awoke to the sound of static from her handheld radio, followed by a burst of overlapping transmissions. The interference grew dense, layered with low-frequency vibrations that made the walls tremble. Later reports confirmed that the biologists' instruments had all triggered at once: motion sensors, EMF readers, and infrared cameras detecting massive simultaneous movement within a 200-yard radius. The last thing Anita heard before the transmission died was Dr. Crane's voice, distorted by interference, describing something enormous moving between their tents. The signal dissolved into a roar of white noise, leaving the radio silent in her hands. At dawn, tribal police and emergency teams reached the scientists' camp. Anita saw the overturned field truck before they did, half sunk into the clearing. The vehicle had been flipped onto its roof, the frame collapsed inward as though pressed by unimaginable weight. The metal bore deep, rounded impressions, marks that no known tool or natural event could explain. Standing in the wreckage's shadow, Anita understood that whatever had come for them was still nearby, and that its interest had not faded with the night. The 3 biologists were found unconscious but uninjured, approximately 100 yards from their destroyed vehicle. Anita never saw the moment they were discovered, only the aftermath, their faces pale under the emergency floodlights, their movements sluggish and uncertain. They had been lucky, she thought. though none of them looked it. All three suffered from mild hypothermia and temporary memory loss, unable to recall anything beyond the stroke of midnight. Their expensive scientific equipment was strewn across the forest like discarded bones, some pieces embedded in tree trunks 20 feet above ground, as if thrown there by impossible force. Dr. Crane's infrared camera, retrieved by deputies, had captured 47 seconds before dying. Anita watched the playback on a deputy's tablet, numb as the thermal image revealed a towering bipedal shape crossing the campsite at 1:11 in the morning, 8, maybe 9 feet tall. Its heat signature fluctuated strangely, pulsing in uneven waves that no one could explain. She thought of the rhythmic knocking on her own walls, of the heavy breath she sometimes swore she could feel through the floorboards. The creature's heat map glowed and then vanished, replaced by static. Dr. Crane refused to return to Hollow Valley afterward. Anita read his report days later, a single sterile paragraph recommending that the area be closed to researchers. No one mentioned what else might live there. The silence that followed was worse than ridicule. It was abandonment. Back at the Gray Wolf house, the fallout from the scientists' retreat pressed down like a physical weight. Anita understood finally that no one would help them. The decision to leave was immediate, but Maya's plea for one more day, just one more recording, cut deep. She said she was close to proving it existed. Anita had no words left to argue. Against everything maternal in her, she agreed to stay. That night, the smell grew unbearable. It wasn't rot anymore, but something acidic, almost manufactured, seeping through the walls until their eyes burned. Anita sealed every window, dragged furniture against the doors, and refused to step outside. Even the dogs seemed hollowed out, lying together in silence, their ribs trembling with each breath. The air inside the house felt heavy, charged with the same pressure that came before lightning. She could feel it watching, waiting. By June 15th, the valley had turned hostile. Weather alerts warned of severe electrical storms and potential tornadic activity, but Anita barely heard them. She spent the day packing methodically, forcing her hands to move even as static hissed through every device. Radios spat nonsense, cell signals dissolved into bursts of interference. The air smelled of metal. When the storm hit at 9:37, it sounded like the sky tearing apart. Lightning strobed through the windows, each flash revealing the motionless dogs, the trembling curtains, the outline of the forest beyond. At 9:47, the grid failed. Darkness swallowed the property. Then came the knocking, not the scattered taps of previous nights, but a full assault, measured, powerful, deliberate. The house shuddered as though gripped by unseen hands. Anita felt the floor flex beneath her feet, dishes clattering from shelves, window panes vibrating in rhythm. Somewhere deep inside the structure, something answered each strike with a groan of wood under strain. She grabbed the phone, fighting static, her voice barely rising above the noise. The dispatcher would later note the time, 9:47 and 32 seconds, and the garbled fragments of what she said. The connection pulsed with distortion, each syllable smeared by interference. Anita remembered hearing movement in Maya's room and a heavy step outside, close, circling. The power surged once, flickered, and died. Then that freight train sound roared overhead, a force of wind or something else pressing against the walls. She tried again to speak. The voice that emerged didn't sound like hers. She said something was shaking the house, that Maya was inside, that it was here. The call ended abruptly. Dispatch marked it at 9:49 and 4 seconds, when lightning hit the ridge, blinding white and final. By the time rescuers arrived after midnight, the storm had broken. The door hung open, rain sweeping through the rooms. Furniture lay overturned, glass scattered like salt. Anita's awareness of that night would later fracture into fragments. The smell of ozone, the static still humming in her teeth, and the silence that followed. Outside, they found the tracks, Maya's small footprints running from the porch into the woods, pressed deep into the mud as though each step had been forced by something close behind. The stride length made no sense for a child. Anita would replay that image forever, those tiny prints vanishing into the trees, chased by something that left only enormous symmetrical impressions on the earth. The search dogs refused to follow. They approached the ridge, then froze, whining and trembling until their handlers dragged them back. Whatever waited beyond that line, even the animals understood they were not meant to cross. The trail ended at a rocky outcropping half a mile from the house, and Anita knew the search was over long before anyone said it. Maya's footprints simply stopped, pressed deep into the soft earth, and then gone, as if the ground itself had swallowed her. There were no signs of a fall, no scuff marks, no drag lines. The larger impressions, the ones that followed, continued for another 50 yards before vanishing on hard stone. She studied the ground until her vision blurred, unable to understand how something that heavy could stop leaving tracks. The official search expanded quickly after that. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors beating over the valley, while search teams spread through the forest with bright vests and radios that crackled through static. 50 volunteers joined in, calling her daughter's name over and over into the trees. The sound echoed strangely, as if the valley itself refused to return it. For 6 days they searched, through rising heat, rain, and the chemical smell that seemed to linger even after the storm passed. No one found a single trace of Maya beyond that ridge. When the state officials arrived with their reports and explanations, their words barely registered. They said the storm had caused disorientation. They said the terrain was dangerous and that Maya must have fallen somewhere unseen. Anita listened but felt detached from everything, like the conversation was taking place in another room. On June 21, 2015, the search was officially ended. The paperwork said, "Death by misadventure," but Anita could still smell the sour electricity in the air and the damp soil where the prints had stopped. After the searchers left, the silence of Hollow Valley grew unbearable. Anita stayed behind, unable to leave the ridge where the trail ended. She built a small camp from what remained of their supplies, a plastic tarp and the remnants of the storm shelter. Locals later said they saw her wandering at dawn, moving quietly among the trees, keeping watch as if waiting for something to return. She marked each passing night by the sound of distant knocking that no one else seemed to hear. The cold didn't matter. The hunger didn't matter. The ridge had become the last place her daughter existed, and she couldn't abandon it. 3 weeks later, she was found by a county patrol officer, dehydrated and barely conscious. They said she resisted evacuation, insisting she needed to stay where the ground broke off. She was transported to Eastern State Hospital in Veneta, placed under observation in a quiet ward with sealed windows and soft lighting. Investigators visited her frequently in those first days, hoping to piece together what had happened in the woods, but her answers only deepened their confusion. The diagnosis was written in careful medical language, acute stress reaction with psychotic features, but the doctors never understood what she had seen or what she was still listening for at night when she refused to sleep. 5 years passed before anyone found anything tangible. In the summer of 2020, hikers moving through an unmarked section of Hollow Valley discovered skeletal remains scattered near a dry creek bed, over a mile from where the original search had ended. The bones were light, almost bleached by time, and the earth around them had hardened into pale clay. DNA confirmed what Anita had already known since the night of the storm. The remains belonged to Maya Graywolf. The announcement brought no comfort, only the final confirmation that the valley had taken her child and then returned her as proof. The official record lists the case as unresolved, death by misadventure, circumstances undetermined. The language is cautious, bureaucratic, meant to close a file. But the evidence remains. Those impossible tracks, the magnetic interference, the shape burned into a camera's memory. In Anita's mind, the valley still breathes. What happened there was never meant to be explained by the kind of people who write reports. On October 9, 2016, a fisherman fled the waters in terror, leaving behind torn-apart gear and footprints too massive to belong to any human. The physical evidence left behind was so disturbing that even investigators struggled to explain what his rod had hooked. Mark Halperin had chosen that bend in Hoh River for good reason. The current slowed there, creating a deep pool where bottom feeders like to congregate after dark. Mark had been fishing these waters for the better part of 15 years, ever since moving to Port Angeles for work. The first cast landed where the water deepened into a dark pool. The 80-pound braided line was overkill for most river fishing, but Mark had learned to appreciate its strength after losing too many big fish to lighter tackle. After 20 minutes, a slight tug on the line brought Mark's attention back to his rod. He said that at first he thought it wasn't a fish, probably just the current pushing his weight against some underwater obstruction. But Mark lifted the rod and felt weight, not the dead pull of a snag, but something with substance and resistance. Mark felt his pulse quicken as he prepared for what might be a significant fish. But what happened next would replay in Mark's mind for the rest of his life. The weight on his line suddenly intensified, not with the gradual increase typical of a feeding fish, but with a shocking, immediate force that nearly tore the rod from his hands. The power was immense, steady, and strangely purposeful. Not the erratic runs and jumps typical of a hooked salmon, but something that seemed to be testing the limits of his equipment with deliberate intent. Mark braced his feet against the rocky shore and leaned back, trying to gain some leverage against whatever was on the other end of his line. The drag continued its high-pitched whine as the line disappeared from his reel at an alarming rate. He'd stated that he started the evening with nearly 200 yards of backing, but at that rate, he'd be down to the spool in minutes. But the movement stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Mark found himself holding a rod, bent nearly double, the line taut as a guitar string, connected to something that had simply decided to stop moving. He tried to pump the rod, working to regain some line, but whatever he'd hooked remained absolutely motionless. It was like being connected to a submerged car. Then the movement resumed, but now it was different. Not the steady pull of before, but a series of short, powerful jerks that sent shockwaves up through the rod and into Mark's arms. Each jerk was followed by a brief pause, as if whatever was on the other end was testing different angles or approaches. The pattern was too regular, too methodical to be the random struggles of a hooked fish. Mark's lantern flickered as a gust of wind moved through the trees, casting dancing shadows across the water. In that brief moment of shifting light, he thought he saw something break the surface near the far bank. Not the silver flash of a fish, but something dark and substantial that disappeared before he could focus on it. The line went slack. Mark reeled frantically, expecting to find his hook straightened or his line broken. But as he retrieved the slack, he felt weight again. Not the dead weight of a snag, but something moving slowly through the water toward his position. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Whatever he'd hooked was swimming directly toward him. This was the moment when Mark's 15 years of fishing experience became irrelevant. Every instinct told him that fish didn't behave this way, that nothing in the river should be able to generate the kind of sustained power he'd just experienced. But the evidence was undeniable. Something large and strong was connected to his line, and it was approaching his position with what seemed like deliberate intent. The water near the bank began to roil and churn as something large moved just beneath the surface. Mark could see the disturbance clearly in his lantern light, a V-shaped wake that suggested something swimming with purpose rather than struggling against a hook. The wake was too large, too organized, too directed to be anything he recognized. What could be strong enough to move like that? Mark's hands began to shake as he continued to reel, no longer trying to fight whatever was on his line, but simply responding to its approach. The rod remained bent, the line tight, but now he was following rather than leading. Whatever was down there had taken control of the situation, and Mark was beginning to understand that he was no longer fishing. He was being fished. The churning water moved closer to shore, and Mark caught his first clear glimpse of what he'd hooked. What he saw in that moment would shatter every assumption he'd ever made about the natural world. The hook was embedded in thick matted fur, covering what was unmistakably a forearm. Not the sleek hide of a river otter or the coarse coat of a bear, but something that belonged to no animal Mark had ever encountered. The fur was dark, almost black in the lantern light, and hung in heavy waterlogged clumps that dripped river water back into the current. Embedded throughout the matted coat were fragments of vegetation, pine needles, moss, small twigs, as if the creature had been moving through dense forest before entering the water. But it was the arm itself that made Mark's breath catch in his throat. The proportions were wrong for any known animal, too long and too heavily muscled, with a structure that suggested both immense strength and surprising dexterity. The forearm alone appeared to be nearly 3 feet in length, covered in that strange thick fur that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the lantern's glow. Mark's fishing rod remained bent in a deep arc. The 80-pound braided line stretched taut between his reel and whatever was attached to his hook. The tension remained constant, as if the creature was simply allowing itself to be connected rather than fighting to escape. This passive acceptance was perhaps more unsettling than any struggle would have been. Why wasn't it pulling away? The water continued to churn as more of the creature became visible. Mark caught glimpses of a massive torso, broad shoulders that seemed to span an impossible width, and what appeared to be another arm moving beneath the surface. The scale was overwhelming. This was not just large, but enormous in a way that challenged his ability to process what he was seeing. Then the eyes appeared. He said that 2 points of reflected light caught the lantern's beam and held it, staring directly at Mark from a distance of perhaps 30 feet. They were positioned too high above the water, too far apart, and too intelligent in their focus to belong to any animal he knew. Was it assessing him as prey or something else? Mark found himself frozen, rod still in his hands, staring back at those reflected eyes across the dark water. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his body seemed incapable of movement. He said that the creature remained motionless as well, as if both man and beast were locked in a moment of mutual assessment that neither was prepared to break. The smell hit him then. He described a complex mixture of wet fur, river mud, and something else, something wild and organic that he couldn't identify. The odor was so strong and distinctive that Mark knew he would recognize it instantly if he ever encountered it again. The creature began to move toward shore with deliberate, powerful strokes that sent waves lapping against the rocky bank. Mark could see more of its form now, the massive head and shoulders, the incredible breadth of its chest, the way it moved through the water with an efficiency that spoke of both strength and familiarity with aquatic environments. This was not an animal that had accidentally fallen into the river, but one that was completely at home. Had he stumbled onto a creature evolved for both land and water? As it approached the shallows, the creature's full size became apparent. Even partially submerged, it was clear that this was something of extraordinary proportions. Easily 8 feet tall, possibly more, with a body mass that Mark estimated at well over 400 pounds. The way it moved suggested that every ounce of that weight was functional muscle, built for power and endurance rather than speed. The creature reached the shallows and began to rise from the water. Mark watched in fascination and terror as it revealed its full form, water cascading from its massive frame like a primordial emergence from some ancient world. The torso was barrel-shaped and incredibly broad, covered in the same dark matted fur that hung in heavy clumps. The arms were disproportionately long, reaching nearly to what would have been knee level on a human, with hands that appeared both massive and surprisingly articulated. But it was when the creature stood to its full height that Mark truly understood the magnitude of what he was witnessing. The thing towered above the riverbank, easily 9 feet tall, its head nearly lost in the shadows above the lantern's reach. The proportions were simultaneously human-like and utterly alien, familiar enough to be recognizable, strange enough to be terrifying. How could something so humanoid exist undiscovered? The creature examined the fishing line that connected them, following it with its eyes from Mark's rod to where the hook was embedded in its forearm. There was no sign of pain or distress, only what appeared to be curiosity about this unexpected connection. Then, with a movement so casual it seemed almost dismissive, the creature reached across with its free hand and grabbed the braided fishing line. Mark watched in disbelief as those massive fingers closed around the 80-pound test line, meant to hold the biggest fish in the Pacific Northwest, and snapped it as easily as breaking a twig. To put it in perspective, that line was designed to handle the pull of a full-grown grizzly bear's swipe if it were hooked on it. But this creature did it with one hand, without any effort. The sound was sharp and final, like a small whip cracking. Mark's rod straightened instantly, the sudden release nearly knocking him backward off his log. He stared at the loose line hanging from his rod tip, then back at the creature, which now studied the broken end with what seemed like casual curiosity. Later, it hit him. Nothing alive, he knew, could combine that kind of raw strength with such careful, deliberate control. The line hadn't frayed or stretched. It had simply been cut in one effortless motion. What kind of animal could do that? But in the moment, Mark was focused entirely on the creature itself, which had now turned its full attention to removing the hook from its arm. He watched as those enormous hands worked with surprising delicacy, grasping the hook's shank and working it free from the matted fur with careful, precise movements. There was a brief flinch, the first sign of discomfort the creature had shown, as the barbed point pulled free, but no sound of pain or distress. The creature examined the hook for a moment, turning it over in its palm as if studying this strange artifact from the human world. Then it looked directly at Mark, and in that moment of eye contact, Mark said he felt something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The unmistakable sense that he was being evaluated by an intelligence that was both alien and familiar, primitive and sophisticated. The vocalization that followed was unlike anything Mark had ever heard. It began as a low rumble, so deep that he felt it as much as heard it, a vibration that seemed to resonate in his chest cavity and travel through his bones. The sound built gradually, taking on harmonic overtones that suggested a complex vocal apparatus capable of producing sounds far beyond the range of any known animal. The rumble evolved into something that was almost speech-like, a series of modulated tones that carried clear emotional content even though Mark could not understand their meaning. There was no aggression in the sound, no threat or challenge, but rather something that seemed almost conversational, as if the creature was attempting to communicate something important. Mark tried to speak, but only a stammered gasp escaped him. Would it even recognize him as a being worth responding to? The creature tilted its massive head at the sound of his voice, and Mark caught his first clear glimpse of its face in the lantern light. The features were undeniably primate-like, but scaled up to proportions that seemed impossible. The brow ridge was pronounced and heavy, shadowing eyes that reflected the light with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware. The nose was broad and flat, the mouth wide and expressive. The creature made another vocalization, softer this time. According to him, it was almost questioning in tone. It took a step closer to the bank, and Mark could see the water streaming from its massive frame, pooling at its feet in the rocky shallows. The movement was fluid and controlled, showing no sign of the awkwardness that might be expected from such a large creature moving from water to land. Mark's analytical mind, trained by years of observing wildlife behavior, noted details that would later prove crucial to investigators attempting to understand what had occurred. The creature's gait was distinctly bipedal, with a stride length and foot placement that suggested a being perfectly adapted to walking upright. Its balance was excellent, showing none of the forward lean or knuckle-walking posture associated with known great apes. He later told investigators that, at that moment, he was thinking that he caught Bigfoot with his fishing rod. The creature reached down and picked up a smooth river stone, examining it briefly before setting it aside. The gesture was casual, almost absent-minded, but it demonstrated a level of manual dexterity that was remarkable for hands of such size. Mark could see that the fingers were long and articulated, with what appeared to be opposable thumbs. Was it planning something or simply playing? Another step brought the creature to the very edge of the water, close enough that Mark could see individual droplets falling from its fur, close enough that the wild organic smell became almost overwhelming. The creature was now less than 20 feet away, well within the circle of light cast by the lantern, and Mark could observe details that would be burned into his memory forever. The fur was not uniform in color or texture. While predominantly dark brown or black, there were patches of lighter coloration around the face and chest, and areas where the fur appeared to have been worn thin by contact with vegetation or rough surfaces. The overall impression was of a creature that lived entirely in the wild, with no contact with human civilization or domestication. Then the creature did something that would change Mark's understanding of what he was witnessing. It reached down and picked up another stone, this one larger and more angular than the first. But instead of examining it and setting it aside, the creature drew back its arm and hurled the stone into the forest with tremendous force. The sound of the stone crashing through branches and undergrowth was followed immediately by a response, another vocalization, similar to the one the creature had made, but coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the lantern's reach. The creature called again, a complex series of tones that carried clearly across the water, and was answered by what sounded like at least two other voices from different directions in the forest. Mark's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. This creature was not alone. There were others out there in the darkness, others that were now aware of his presence and the unusual situation unfolding on the riverbank. The thought of multiple creatures of this size and apparent intelligence moving through the forest around him was almost too terrifying to contemplate. How many were watching him right now? Then it stopped and stood motionless in the shallows. Mark said that the dim light caught the glint of its eyes, fixed and unblinking, as if weighing a decision. Every instinct in his body screamed to move, yet he couldn't. The creature's stillness was more terrifying than any charge could have been. The creature in the water made one final vocalization, longer and more complex than the others, and Mark had the distinct impression that it was providing some kind of report or explanation to its unseen companions. Then it looked directly at Mark one final time, and in that gaze, Mark said he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. There was recognition there and evaluation, and what might have been a form of respect or acknowledgement. But he said that there was also something else, something that spoke of vast intelligence, of a being that understood far more about the world than Mark had ever imagined possible. The broken fishing line hung limply from his rod tip, one of the few physical evidences that the encounter had been real, rather than some elaborate hallucination. But Mark knew with absolute certainty that what he had experienced was genuine, that in front of him, from the depths of the Ho River, this creature of impossible proportions had examined his hook, evaluated his presence, and chosen not to strike, but not to leave either. Little did he know, that night wasn't about to end in peace. The silence that followed the creature's continued presence was more unsettling than any sound could have been. His mind struggled to process what he had witnessed, cycling between rational explanations that fell apart under scrutiny and the impossible truth that something beyond current scientific understanding had just examined him with obvious intelligence. Then came a sound, soft, deliberate footfalls from the tree line behind him. Another shape shifted in the darkness, tall and broad-shouldered like the first, and then another beside it. Their silhouettes were barely distinguishable, but unmistakably upright, their eyes catching faint glimmers of light. They weren't hiding anymore. He was reminded of his vulnerability. He was alone in the wilderness, miles from the nearest road, with only a small circle of light protecting him from whatever else might be moving through the darkness. The realization was no longer just a thought, it was visible. 3 of them now stood beyond the riverbank, unmoving, half shrouded in mist. One turned its head slowly, tracking his every movement. The air felt heavier, charged with something that wasn't quite a threat, but wasn't curiosity anymore, either. Those same deep vocalizations he had heard during the encounter were now coming from multiple directions, not just those 3. The sounds were not random or chaotic, but seemed to follow a pattern that suggested coordination and purpose. Mark had spent enough time in the wilderness to recognize the difference between animals moving naturally through their environment and the deliberate movement of creatures with specific intent. Whatever these creatures are, they're organized, and they were moving in a way that seemed designed to surround his position. But what happened to the peaceful encounter moments ago? Was that designed so he would lower his guard, or were there disagreements between those creatures? Mark's survival instincts finally overcame his paralysis. He began packing his gear with urgent efficiency, stuffing items into his tackle box and backpack without regard for organization. The lantern would have to stay lit until the last possible moment. The thought of being plunged into complete darkness while those things moved through the forest around him was unbearable. As he worked, Mark caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision. Large shapes shifting between trees just beyond the lantern's reach, always disappearing when he turned to look directly. The movements were too large and too coordinated to be bears or other known wildlife, and they seemed to be maintaining a consistent distance from his position, as if observing rather than approaching. The sound of breaking branches grew closer, and Mark realized that whatever was out there was no longer content to remain hidden. He could hear what sounded like deliberate tree breaking, not the random crack of dead wood falling, but the systematic snapping of living branches, as if something was clearing a path through the forest. The sounds came from at least 5 different directions, suggesting multiple creatures working in coordination. Could he outrun them, or was it already too late? Mark grabbed his lantern and held it high, trying to extend its circle of illumination as far as possible. In the wavering light, he caught his first clear glimpse of one of the creature's companions, a massive silhouette standing motionless between 2 large cedars, easily as large as the being he had encountered in the water. The figure was there for only a moment before melting back into the darkness, but it was long enough for Mark to confirm that he was dealing with aggressive creatures of extraordinary size and apparent intelligence. The realization that he was surrounded by unknown beings of such aggression triggered a primal fear response that overrode all rational thought. Mark abandoned any pretense of orderly packing and began stuffing essential items into his backpack with desperate haste. His truck was parked nearly a mile away along a winding forest trail, and the thought of making that journey through darkness while being stalked by creatures of unknown intent filled him with terror. Another sound froze him in place, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from the ground itself. Mark realized that one of the creatures was striking something against a tree trunk, producing a deep, resonant sound that carried clearly through the forest. The rhythm was complex and deliberate, unmistakably a form of communication rather than random noise. The thumping was answered by similar sounds from other directions, creating a network of acoustic signals that surrounded Mark's position. The pattern was too sophisticated to be coincidental. These creatures could also coordinate their movements through complex signaling. Mark slung his backpack over his shoulders and picked up his tackle box, leaving only the lantern and his broken fishing rod. Then the thumping stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Mark could hear his own heartbeat. The sudden cessation of sound was more ominous to him than the communication had been, suggesting that whatever was out there had finished coordinating and was now ready to act. Mark knew that he could not afford to wait any longer. He kicked the lantern toward the water's edge, hoping that the sudden movement and change in lighting might create enough confusion to cover his escape. The lantern struck a rock and went out instantly. Mark heard a tremendous roar from somewhere behind him, a sound of such volume and fury that it seemed to shake the very ground beneath his feet. Mark ran blindly into the forest, crashing through undergrowth and stumbling over fallen logs in his desperate attempt to reach his truck. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of large bodies moving through the trees, accompanied by more of those deafening roars that spoke of rage and perhaps frustration. The creatures were no longer attempting stealth. They were pursuing him with obvious intent. Were they hunting or just chasing him for sport? Branches whipped across Mark's face as he ran, and roots caught at his feet, sending him stumbling through the darkness. but he didn't dare slow down. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer, and he could hear the crash of undergrowth being trampled by creatures of enormous size and strength. A particularly loud crash from directly behind him spurred Mark to even greater speed. He could hear heavy breathing and the sound of large feet pounding against the forest floor, suggesting that at least one of the creatures was in direct pursuit. The thought of being caught by something of such size and apparent strength filled him with a terror that transcended rational thought. Mark burst through a stand of young alders and found himself on the familiar trail that led back to the logging road where he had parked. The packed earth felt solid and reassuring under his feet after the treacherous terrain of the forest floor, and he was able to increase his pace significantly. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit had taken on a different quality, less frantic crashing and more purposeful movement, as if his pursuers had settled into a sustainable pace for a long chase. Heavy impacts echoed through the trees, rhythmic and coordinated. He could hear them spreading out, flanking him. The forest that had always felt vast now seemed to close in, every shadow filled with movement. Mark rounded a familiar bend and saw the blessed sight of his truck's reflectors gleaming in the distance. He fumbled for his keys as he ran, praying that he wouldn't drop them in his haste to escape. A deep guttural call rolled through the darkness behind him, answered by another closer to his right. The sound froze his blood. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Branches snapped just beyond the reach of his headlamp, something massive keeping pace with him at a terrifyingly steady speed. The truck's door handle felt like salvation under his trembling fingers. Mark threw his gear into the passenger seat and started the engine with shaking hands, not bothering with his seatbelt in his urgency to leave the area. The headlights illuminated the forest road ahead, creating a tunnel of light that led away from the nightmare he had just experienced. As the engine roared to life, a figure emerged from the brush to his left, taller than the hood, shoulders brushing the side mirror as it lunged forward. Mark slammed the accelerator, the tires spinning in the loose gravel before gripping. Something struck the rear panel with a deafening metallic thud, rocking the truck sideways. He sped down the narrow dirt road, headlights bouncing violently over ruts and potholes. In the rearview mirror, the beams of his taillights caught them. 3 silhouettes bursting from the tree line, sprinting upright through the dust. Their strides were unnaturally long, their movements fast and deliberate. One veered onto the road behind him, running straight down the center like a predator closing on prey. Another darted parallel to the truck, vanishing and reappearing between the trees, matching his speed. Mark's breathing came in short, panicked bursts as he took a sharp corner too fast, the truck fishtailing dangerously before he regained control. Gravel sprayed in all directions. He could hear them, heavy footfalls pounding against the earth, then another impact on the truck's tailgate. A deep dent appeared in the metal, visible even through the shaking red light of the rear camera. Something slapped the bed hard enough to rattle the toolbox inside. He floored the gas, the engine screaming, the forest whipping by in blurs of motion. For several unbearable seconds, the silhouettes remained visible in his mirrors, their glowing eyes locked on him, relentless. Then, as he hit the paved section near the highway turnoff, the shapes slowed. One stopped in the middle of the road, illuminated clearly in the receding taillights. A massive, dark figure standing upright, chest heaving, arms hanging loosely at its sides. 2 more joined it from the shadows, forming a silent line across the dirt road. None followed beyond the forest's edge. He left the site in silence, never returning to the Hoh River, haunted by the memory of eyes in the dark. On September 15, 2021, 26-year-old Jake Morrison set out on what should have been a routine solo backpacking trip through the Olympic National Forest in Washington state. An experienced hiker from Portland, Oregon, Jake had been exploring the Pacific Northwest wilderness for over 8 years, documenting his adventures on his popular YouTube channel, Trail Tales with Jake. What began as a 5-day journey to film content for his 1,000 subscribers would become the most terrifying experience of his life. and provide some of the most compelling evidence for Bigfoot's existence ever captured on camera. Jake Morrison wasn't your typical weekend warrior. As a freelance outdoor photographer and content creator, he spent nearly half the year in the wilderness, often alone for weeks at a time. His apartment in Portland was more like a gear storage facility, packed with cameras, camping equipment, and maps of remote trails throughout Oregon and Washington. Friends often joked that Jake was more comfortable sleeping under the stars than in his own bed, and they weren't wrong. The Olympic Peninsula had always held a special fascination for Jake. Its vast expanses of old-growth forest, rugged coastline, and minimal human presence made it perfect for the kind of immersive wilderness content his audience craved. He had hiked sections of the peninsula before, but never attempted the remote Quinault River Trail system that would be his destination for this September trip. Jake's plan was ambitious, but well within his capabilities. He intended to hike 37 miles over 5 days, following the Quinault River deep into the heart of the Olympic wilderness. The trail would take him through some of the most pristine temperate rainforest in North America, past ancient cedar groves and hidden waterfalls that few people ever see. His goal was to document the changing seasons and capture the ethereal beauty of the Pacific Northwest autumn. What Jake didn't know was that the Quinault River Valley had a long history of unexplained encounters. Local Native American tribes, particularly the Quinault Nation, had stories going back generations about the Siatko, large, hairy beings that lived deep in the forest and occasionally revealed themselves to humans. More recently, the area had generated dozens of Bigfoot sighting reports, though most were dismissed by authorities as misidentifications or hoaxes. Jake arrived at the Graves Creek trailhead at 7:30 a.m. on September 15, 2021. The parking area was empty except for one other vehicle, unusual for a Wednesday morning, but not uncommon for such a remote location. He spent 20 minutes organizing his gear and checking his camera equipment, including the GoPro Hero 9 mounted on his chest harness and a handheld Sony A7R4 for still photography. His pack weighed 42 pounds, loaded with 5 days of food, camping gear, and enough camera equipment to document every aspect of his journey. Jake had learned from years of solo hiking that preparation was everything. He carried emergency communication devices, water purification tablets, and enough backup batteries to keep his cameras running for a week. The first day of hiking was exactly what Jake had hoped for. The Quinault River Trail wound through cathedral-like groves of Douglas fir and western red cedar, some over 800 years old. His chest-mounted GoPro captured the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy while he provided commentary for his future video. Jake's voice was clear on the recording as he paused beside a massive cedar, explaining how you could hike for hours without seeing another person, experiencing just yourself and the forest the way it had been for thousands of years. By 4:15 p.m., Jake had covered 8 miles and reached his planned campsite beside Pony Creek. The location was perfect, a small clearing with access to fresh water and enough flat ground for his ultralight tent. As was his routine, Jake spent the first hour setting up camp and organizing his gear before beginning his evening photography session. It was during this golden hour shoot that Jake first noticed something unusual. While reviewing photos on his camera's LCD screen, he spotted what appeared to be a large, dark shape in the background of several images. The shape was partially obscured by trees and could have been a stump or shadow, but something about it bothered him. Jake muttered to himself about how weird it was, zooming in on the image. The shape seemed too tall and narrow to be a stump, and it appeared in 3 consecutive photos taken from slightly different angles. More puzzling, Jake couldn't remember seeing anything that large when he was composing the shots. As darkness fell, Jake prepared dinner on his lightweight camp stove while his cameras continued recording. He had developed a habit of keeping at least one camera running throughout his trips, partly for content, but mostly for safety. If something happened to him, the footage might help rescuers understand what went wrong. At 9:23 p.m., while Jake was cleaning his cooking gear, His GoPro captured a sound that would haunt him for months afterward. A low, resonant call echoed through the forest. Not quite human, but far more complex than any animal vocalization he had heard in 8 years of wilderness camping. The sound lasted about 6 seconds and seemed to come from the direction where he had noticed the strange shape in his photographs. Jake's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of fear, his first instinct was curiosity, the same trait that had driven him to spend his life exploring remote places. He grabbed his headlamp and Sony camera, switching to video mode as he moved toward the edge of his campsite. He whispered to his camera that he had never heard anything like that before, describing how it sounded almost intelligent. For the next 20 minutes, Jake waited at the edge of his campsite, camera ready, listening for any repeat of the strange call. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no small animals moving through the underbrush, nothing. Even the constant sound of Pony Creek seemed muted, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. Jake eventually returned to his tent, but sleep came fitfully. His cameras continued recording throughout the night, capturing several more instances of the mysterious calls. Audio analysis would later reveal that the vocalizations came from multiple directions, suggesting either several creatures or one that was moving around Jake's campsite in a wide circle. Morning brought relief and renewed curiosity. Jake's first task was to review the night's footage, and what he found made his hands shake as he held the camera. At 2:47 a.m., his tent-mounted GoPro had captured a clear image of something moving past his campsite. The figure was upright, easily 7 feet tall, and covered in dark hair. Most remarkably, it moved with deliberate stealth, carefully placing each step to avoid making noise. Jake could barely breathe as he replayed the footage multiple times, realizing that this was actually happening. The creature had passed within 30 feet of Jake's tent, close enough that the camera's night vision mode captured remarkable detail. The figure's proportions were clearly humanoid, but massively built, with arms that hung nearly to its knees and a distinctive sagittal crest visible on top of its head. Most unsettling was the intelligence evident in its movement. This was not a mindless animal, but something that understood it was being watched. Jake's second day of hiking began with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Part of him wanted to pack up and hike out immediately, but his photographer's instincts and natural curiosity won out. He had potentially captured footage of one of the world's most elusive creatures. He couldn't just walk away. The trail on day 2 led deeper into the wilderness, following the Quinaulta River through increasingly dense forest. Jake's pace was slower than usual as he constantly scanned the trees around him, camera ready for any sign of his mysterious visitor. His commentary became more subdued, reflecting his growing awareness that he was no longer alone in the forest. At 11:30 a.m., while crossing a small tributary creek, Jake made a discovery that confirmed his suspicions. Pressed into the muddy bank were footprints unlike anything he had seen in his years of wilderness travel. The prints measured roughly 16 inches long and 7 inches wide, with clearly defined toe impressions that showed this was no bear or known animal. Jake whispered to his camera as he knelt beside the clearest print, noting that they had been made sometime the night before or early that morning. He observed the depth and estimated that whatever made these tracks had to weigh at least 400 pounds. Jake spent 20 minutes documenting the prints from every angle, using his hiking pole for scale and taking detailed measurements. The tracks showed a clear pattern of bipedal movement, with a stride length that suggested something much larger than a human, but walking upright like one. More disturbing was the direction of the tracks. They paralleled the trail Jake was following, staying about 50 yards back in the dense forest. Whatever had made these prints was following him, staying close enough to observe, but far enough away to remain hidden. The realization that he was being stalked sent a chill down Jake's spine. His 8 years of solo hiking had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was now screaming that he was in potential danger. But he was already 12 miles from the nearest road, with no choice but to continue forward or attempt a dangerous solo retreat through unfamiliar terrain. Jake's afternoon became a psychological battle between fear and fascination. His cameras captured his growing paranoia as he constantly looked over his shoulder, jumped at every sound, and second-guessed every decision. Yet he continued hiking deeper into the wilderness, driven by a combination of stubbornness and the knowledge that he might be documenting something extraordinary. At 3:45 p.m., Jake's stalker made its presence known in a way that left no doubt about its intelligence. While taking a break beside a fallen log, Jake heard the same resonant call from the previous night, but this time it came from directly ahead of him on the trail. When he looked up, a massive figure stood in the path about 100 yards away, partially obscured by the forest shadows, but clearly visible. The creature was even larger than Jake had estimated from the night footage. Standing upright, it appeared to be at least 8 feet tall, with a build that suggested immense strength. Its entire body was covered in dark, coarse hair, and its face, while difficult to see clearly, showed unmistakably intelligent eyes that seemed to be studying Jake as intently as he was studying it. Jake whispered with a shaking voice as he slowly raised his camera, acknowledging that it was real and actually happening. The standoff lasted approximately 30 seconds, long enough for Jake to capture several minutes of video footage that would later be analyzed by experts around the world. The creature showed no signs of aggression, but its posture conveyed a clear message. It was aware of Jake's presence and was choosing to reveal itself. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure melted back into the forest with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Jake was left alone on the trail, his heart pounding and his hands shaking as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. The encounter changed everything about Jake's trip. What had begun as a routine backpacking adventure had become something far more significant and dangerous. He now knew with certainty that he was sharing the forest with an unknown creature of remarkable intelligence and size. Jake's decision to continue hiking rather than retreat would prove to be both brave and foolish. Over the next 3 days, his mysterious companion would reveal itself repeatedly, always maintaining a careful distance but making its presence unmistakably known. The psychological pressure of being constantly watched by something so powerful began to take its toll. Day 3 brought more direct encounters. Jake's morning routine was interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps circling his campsite, just beyond the range of his camera's night vision. When he emerged from his tent at dawn, he found that his food bag hung 12 feet high in a tree, according to proper bear safety protocols, had been carefully lowered and placed beside his tent. Nothing was missing, but the message was clear. His stalker could have taken anything it wanted. Jake told his camera that this was getting really weird, his voice tight with stress. He described how it seemed like the creature was trying to communicate or something, but he didn't know what it wanted. The trail on day 3 led through some of the most remote wilderness in the Olympic Peninsula. Jake saw no other hikers, no aircraft overhead, no signs of human presence except the faint path beneath his feet. His isolation was complete, shared only with a creature that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of known science. At midday, while filming a segment about old-growth forest ecology, Jake captured footage that would become some of the most analyzed Bigfoot evidence ever recorded. His handheld camera was focused on a massive cedar when something moved in the background. A dark figure that stepped briefly into view before disappearing behind another tree. The figure was clearly the same creature Jake had been encountering, but this footage showed it in daylight with remarkable clarity. Its human-like posture was unmistakable, as was the intelligence evident in how it used the forest cover to remain mostly hidden while still allowing itself to be seen. Jake realized while reviewing the footage on his camera screen that the creature knew he was filming and was choosing when to show itself. This revelation was both thrilling and terrifying. Jake was documenting behavior that suggested a level of intelligence far beyond what mainstream science attributed to any unknown primate. His stalker wasn't just avoiding humans, it was actively managing its interactions with them. The psychological pressure intensified on day 4. Jake's sleep was constantly interrupted by sounds around his campsite, footsteps, breathing, and occasional vocalizations that seemed designed to let him know he was being watched. His cameras captured glimpses of movement throughout each night, but never enough to provide the definitive proof that would convince skeptics. Jake's commentary became increasingly strained as exhaustion and stress took their toll. He admitted to his camera on the morning of day 4 that he didn't know how much more of this he could take, feeling like he was losing his mind out there. But Jake's ordeal was far from over. Day 4 would bring the most intense encounter yet, one that would test his courage and provide footage that cryptozoologists would study for years to come. The trail on day 4 climbed steadily toward Enchanted Valley, a remote alpine meadow surrounded by towering peaks. As Jake gained elevation, the forest began to thin, providing less cover for his mysterious companion. He hoped this might mean an end to the constant surveillance, but he was wrong. At 2:30 p.m., while crossing an open meadow, Jake heard the now familiar call echoing off the surrounding mountains. But this time, the sound came from multiple directions, at least 3 different sources positioned around the meadow's perimeter. Jake realized with growing alarm that he wasn't being followed by one creature, but by several. He whispered to his camera that there was more than one, slowly turning to scan the tree line and realizing they had him surrounded. The meadow crossing became the longest 10 minutes of Jake's life. He could feel eyes watching him from the forest edge, and his cameras captured several glimpses of large, dark shapes moving between the trees. The creatures were coordinating their movements, staying hidden while maintaining visual contact with their human visitor. Jake reached the far side of the meadow without incident, but the message was clear. He was completely at the mercy of beings that could have overwhelmed him at any time. Their restraint suggested either benevolent intentions or a level of strategic thinking that was deeply unsettling. The final night of Jake's trip brought the most dramatic encounter yet. Camped beside a small alpine lake, Jake was awakened at 3:15 a.m. by the sound of something large moving through his campsite. His tent-mounted camera captured a figure approaching to within 10 feet of where he lay, close enough that he could hear its breathing through the thin nylon walls. The creature stayed beside Jake's tent for nearly 20 minutes, occasionally making soft vocalizations that sounded almost conversational. Jake lay perfectly still, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure the creature could hear it. The footage from that night would later reveal remarkable details about the being's physical characteristics and behavior. When Jake finally worked up the courage to peer through his tent's mesh window, he found himself looking directly into a face that would haunt his dreams for months afterward. The creature's eyes reflected his headlamp's light, showing an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and curious. For several seconds, human and unknown beings studied each other through the thin barrier of the tent wall. Then, as if satisfied with what it had learned, the creature withdrew into the darkness, leaving Jake alone with the knowledge that he had just experienced something that would change his life forever. Jake's final day of hiking was a blur of exhaustion and relief. The creatures that had followed him for 4 days seemed to have withdrawn, perhaps satisfied that he was leaving their territory. His pace was faster than usual, driven by a desperate desire to return to the familiar world of roads and cell phone signals. The Graves Creek trailhead appeared through the trees like a vision of salvation. Jake's truck sat exactly where he had left it 5 days earlier, but he felt like a completely different person from the one who had started this journey. His cameras contained footage that would challenge everything science thought it knew about the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. Jake's first stop after leaving the trailhead was the Quinault Ranger Station, where he reported his encounters to skeptical but professional park rangers. His footage was copied and forwarded to wildlife biologists and law enforcement agencies, beginning a chain of analysis that would eventually reach the highest levels of government. The drive back to Portland gave Jake time to process what he had experienced. By the time he reached his apartment, he had made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would dedicate himself to understanding and documenting the creatures he had encountered, regardless of the personal cost or professional ridicule that might follow. Jake's first week back in Portland was a whirlwind of sleepless nights and obsessive video review. He had captured over 40 hours of footage during his 5-day trip, and hidden within that material were dozens of brief glimpses, sounds, and anomalies that painted a picture of intelligence beyond anything he had imagined possible in the wilderness. The clearest footage came from his final night, when the creature had approached his tent. Frame-by-frame analysis revealed details that made Jake's hands shake as he worked at his computer. The being's facial features showed a blend of human and ape characteristics, but the eyes held an awareness that transcended both. When enhanced and slowed down, the creature's vocalizations revealed complex tonal patterns that suggested structured communication. Jake's YouTube channel had always focused on the beauty and solitude of wilderness hiking, but now he faced an impossible decision. Publishing his Bigfoot footage would transform his life in ways he couldn't predict. His credibility as an outdoor educator would be questioned. His peaceful hiking adventures would become media circuses, and he would forever be known as that Bigfoot guy, rather than the serious nature photographer he had worked years to become. But the evidence was too compelling to ignore. Jake had always prided himself on honesty with his audience, and hiding this discovery felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for. After a week of agonizing deliberation, he made his choice. On September 28, 2021, Jake uploaded a video titled, "Something Followed Me for 5 Days in the Olympic Wilderness, Raw Footage." The 43-minute compilation included his clearest encounters, enhanced audio of the vocalizations, and detailed analysis of the footprint evidence. His introduction was simple and direct, explaining that he had been hiking alone in the wilderness for 8 years and had never experienced anything like this. He wasn't asking viewers to believe him, he was just showing them what happened so they could draw their own conclusions. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, the video had been viewed over 100,000 times and generated thousands of comments, ranging from supportive to skeptical to outright hostile. Major news outlets picked up the story, and Jake found himself fielding interview requests from around the world. Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum from Idaho State University was among the first scientists to contact Jake directly. As one of the world's leading experts on Bigfoot evidence, Dr. Meldrum had seen countless hoaxes and misidentifications, but Jake's footage impressed him with its consistency and detail. Dr. Meldrum explained during their first phone conversation that what struck him about Jake's documentation was the behavioral coherence. These weren't random encounters. They showed a pattern of intelligent observation and interaction that was very difficult to fake convincingly. The scientific analysis that followed was more thorough than anything Jake had expected. Audio experts studied the vocalizations, finding harmonic frequencies and structural patterns that didn't match any known North American wildlife. Primatologists analyzed the creature's movement patterns, noting locomotion characteristics that suggested a large bipedal primate adapted for forest environments. Most compelling was the analysis of Jake's footprint casts. Dr. Grover Krantz's former colleagues at Washington State University examined the plaster impressions using techniques developed for forensic investigations. The prints showed dermal ridges, pressure patterns, and anatomical details that would be nearly impossible to fabricate convincingly. But not everyone was convinced. Skeptical organizations like the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry published detailed critiques of Jake's evidence, suggesting alternative explanations ranging from misidentified bears to elaborate hoaxes. The debate raged across social media platforms and academic forums, with Jake caught in the middle of a controversy he had never sought. The attention took a serious toll on Jake's personal life. His girlfriend of 3 years, Sarah, struggled with the sudden media scrutiny and the way their relationship had become secondary to Jake's obsession with his forest encounters. Friends who had once joined him on hiking trips now made excuses to avoid the cameras and questions that followed him everywhere. Sarah told him during one of their final arguments that he wasn't the same person who had left for that trip. It was like those things in the forest had taken away the Jake she fell in love with and left someone else in his place. She wasn't wrong. Jake found himself unable to enjoy simple hikes without constantly scanning the forest for signs of his mysterious watchers. Every shadow could hide a massive figure. Every unusual sound might be an attempt at communication. The wilderness that had once been his sanctuary had become a place of constant vigilance and anticipation. But Jake's dedication to understanding his experience also brought unexpected connections. He began corresponding with other witnesses who had remained silent for years, afraid of ridicule or disbelief. Their stories revealed a pattern of encounters throughout the Pacific Northwest that suggested a stable population of these creatures living in the most remote wilderness areas. Maria Santos, a wildlife biologist from Bellingham, contacted Jake 6 months after his video went viral. She had been conducting unofficial research into Bigfoot sightings for over a decade, documenting reports from credible witnesses including park rangers, wildlife photographers, and experienced outdoors people. Maria explained during their first meeting that Jake's footage corroborated behavioral patterns she had been tracking for years. These creatures seemed to have a complex social structure and territorial behavior that was far more sophisticated than mainstream science acknowledged. Together, Jake and Maria began planning return expeditions to the Olympic Peninsula, using Jake's documented encounter locations as starting points for more systematic research. They installed motion-activated cameras throughout the Quinault River Valley and began collecting environmental DNA samples from water sources where the creatures might drink. The research yielded tantalizing results. Several cameras captured brief glimpses of large, bipedal figures moving through the forest at night. Water samples contained genetic material that didn't match any known species in scientific databases. Most intriguingly, audio recordings revealed complex vocalizations that seemed to represent a form of long-distance communication between different groups. Jake's life had been permanently altered by his 5 days in the Olympic wilderness. His YouTube channel evolved from hiking entertainment to serious cryptozoological research, attracting a global audience of researchers, witnesses, and curious observers. He published a book about his experience, Followed: 5 Days with the Unknown, which became a bestseller in the cryptozoology community. But success came with a price. Jake's relationships suffered under the weight of his obsession, and his mental health struggled with the constant pressure of being a public figure in a controversial field. He began working with a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery, learning to process the psychological impact of his encounters. His therapist, Dr. Rebecca Chen, explained that what he had experienced was a form of contact with an intelligence that existed outside normal understanding. It was natural that such an encounter would fundamentally change how he saw the world and his place in it. 3 years after his original encounter, Jake continues to research and document evidence of Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest. His work has contributed to a growing body of scientific literature that suggests these creatures may represent a surviving population of ancient hominids that have adapted to life in North America's most remote wilderness areas. The creatures that followed Jake for 5 days in September 2021 remain as mysterious as ever, but their brief interaction with one curious human has opened a window into a hidden world that exists parallel to our own, reminding us that even in our modern age of satellite imagery and GPS tracking, the wilderness still holds secrets that challenge our understanding of what's possible. Jake's story serves as a reminder that sometimes the most profound discoveries come not from seeking them out, but from remaining open to the unexpected encounters that await those brave enough to venture alone into the wild places where mystery still lives. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.